Good morning, colleagues. Bonjour tout le monde. Bon matin, chers collègues.
Good morning, dear colleagues.
Are gathering together for the 117th meeting of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. We have another 3 hours this morning and into the early afternoon. I noted that there was some surprise on the part of members that there was breakfast this morning. It feels as though perhaps this is one of the earlier meeting times. So I hope everyone is enjoying the change in meal plans. We have with us this morning witnesses from the Translation Bureau, who I will introduce in a moment. Dans un moment, je vais passer la parole.
In a moment, I will turn the floor over to our witnesses for the morning.
Colleagues and to witnesses that when you're not using your earpiece, if you can just make sure, please, that it is placed on the sticker to either your left or right-hand side in order to respect the health and well-being of our translators, which, of course, of anyone, you would fully understand. So with that, colleagues, we continue our study. This is the second meeting on the study of a review of the members of the House of Commons workplace harassment and violence prevention policy. I thought that the last meeting was incredibly informative, productive, and respectful. I hope that we can continue in that regard. Without any further delay, I would like to welcome Jean-François Limburner from the Translation Bureau, the Chief Executive Officer, Matthew Ball, Vice President, Service to Parliament and Interpretation, and Annie Trépanier, the Vice President of Policy and Corporate. You will have 10 minutes collectively, or up to 10 minutes as a group for opening statements. And with that, I pass it over to you, Mr. Limburner.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour tout le monde.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. I would like to acknowledge the presence of my colleagues Annie Trépanier, Vice President, Policy and Corporate Services, Matthew Ball, my two colleagues. I would also like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. Mr. Chair, honourable members of the committee, thank you for this invitation to contribute to your review of the members of the House of Commons workplace harassment and violence prevention policy. We are pleased to be able to discuss with you today the long-standing relationship between members of Parliament and our employees as we celebrate, and I'd like to underscore this, the 90th anniversary of the Translation Bureau. In fact, for 90 years now, we've been providing quality linguistic services that, again, I remind you of this, that are essential to the smooth running of Parliament.
Just rarely have opportunity to meet the parliamentarians from whom they work. Quite the opposite is true for the interpreter, who spent most of their days and often their evening with elected officials. Since the inauguration of the simultaneous interpretation in the House of Commons, that was 65 years ago, Bureau interpreters are seen and especially heard at most parliamentary meetings. And on that note, I would really like to take the opportunity to say thank you to Mathieu, Christine, and Caroline, who are interpreting our session today. Monsieur le Président, interpreters have no direct reporting relationship with MPs. They are not part of the political or parliamentary staff, but rather of core public administration. And all those MPs and their primary target audience, they have to interact with them directly, except on a few occasions when they are called upon to stand beside them and offer what we call as an elbow interpretation. Interpreters are usually isolated in their booth, and the clerk of the House of Commons Administration act as their intermediaries with the MPs. That said, MPs have direct impact on the working condition of interpreters. Through their discipline during interpreted meeting, certain basic behaviors such as respecting the rights to speak go a long way towards facilitating the work of interpreters, in addition to preventing the acoustic incident that can occur when more than one microphone is open at the same time. À ce sujet, Monsieur le Président,
on this subject, Mr. Chair, the honourable members of your committee will be aware that a number of directives, procedures, and measures have been implemented over the past few years to promote sound quality and thus protect the hearing and health of our interpreters. Interpreters, already 10 years ago, started reporting symptoms after providing simultaneous interpretation virtual and hybrid meetings. Since then, We have been steadfastly taking steps to better understand and prevent risk to interpreters with the help of the House of Commons administration, which is responsible for providing technical support for interpretation. Drawing inspiration from the many study reports we have obtained and lessons learned from our consultations abroad, we implemented several protection measures. The Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs mentioned these measures in May 2020 and again in 2023 January reports entitled Parliamentary Duties and the COVID-19 Pandemic and Future of Hybrid Proceedings in the House of Commons. And to sum up some of these measures, there are interpretation consoles designed to protect hearing are being used. A technician is assigned to each meeting with simultaneous interpretation. Sound tests must be carried out before each meeting. Anyone speaking virtually, as we have today, is required to use an ISO microphone. Otherwise, what they say will not be interpreted.
Position of a Director of Parliamentary Affairs and Interpreter Well-Being to ensure that effectiveness and enhancement of protective measures. Over the past years, our Director have worked with the House of Commons administration to develop protocols that formalize the prevention and management of acoustic incident. He also drew up a continuous improvement plan under which we received this year the results of the 3 new studies, 2 on the sound transmitted and 1 on the change on the hearing of the interpreters. We look forward to receiving the expert recommendation by the end of this year. I'm happy to report, Mr. Chair, that all of these efforts are paying off. While 128 acoustic incidents were reported in 2022, 74 have been recorded in 2023, and so far this year we only have 10. Of course, incidents still happen. Sound is a very highly complex thing that is very difficult to control perfectly, and there will always be a risk of an acoustic incident. Nevertheless, we're determined to continue our working as a team with the House administration and experts in the field to minimize the risk. Most recently, following a direction received from the Labour Program of Employment and Social Development Canada, new guidelines for handling earpiece, as mentioned this morning, have been introduced to prevent audio feedback, also known as Larsen effect. Monsieur le Président, le Bureau de la Traduction sait à quel point ces...
Mr. Chair, the Translation Bureau knows that these measures increase the complexity of our meetings, and we are grateful to your honourable colleagues for their goodwill in complying with them. We are also cognizant of the frustration that MPs can feel when, despite all of the precautions, a meeting has to be interrupted because the sound is not of sufficient quality to allow for interpretation. For somebody who has never interpreted, it can be difficult to imagine how a seemingly minor sound problem could prevent interpretation. But because interpreters have to speak while they are listening and also look, they require sound quality that is superior to that required by participants. A bit of crackling that an ordinary participant would hardly notice can cause interpreters to experience headaches and hearing problems. That is why we have instructed our interpreters to stop interpreting in the event of sound problems.
Often unpopular, even if the clerk then act as an intermediary between the MPs and the interpreter, some MP may express dissatisfaction and the interpreter may be or feel targeted. But at the end, despite the inconvenience, one thing is clear: interpreters cannot interpret what they cannot hear. And they should never put themselves at risk by attempting to plow ahead to avoid criticism. This is why our protocol clearly stipulates that if pressure is placed on an interpreter not to interrupt the service or to resume it despite poor sound quality, they must contact the supervisor immediately and we'll intervene to rectify the situation. That being said, so far, thanks to the great collaboration with the clerk and the committee chairs, interaction have been respectful. Il n'en demeure pas moins que l'existence d'outils comme la politique que vous avez examinée ou que vous examinez actuellement est très...
Nonetheless, tools such as the policy you're currently reviewing are very useful for diffusing any conflicts that might arise in the context of parliamentary meetings where emotions can run high. Although we have never had to use it, we are grateful to the honourable members for introducing it, and we thank the committee for seeking our comments regarding its implementation. We would be happy to take your questions now. Thank you.
Excellent, mais merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'm encouraged to hear that there has been an exceptional improvement following the implementation of the new rules. And without any doubt, the interpreters do such an important job here on our behalf. So thank you for being with us.
Enter our first round of questioning. And Mr. Duncan, I believe you would like the floor, and you will have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here this morning. Happy 90th anniversary to the organization and your team, and thank you for the work that you do. I always say I have to make sure I talk slow. I speak Duncanese sometimes, as our family would say in Eastern Ontario, so I come to respect more often, more and more, the longer I'm here, the work that you do day in and day out. You referenced the reports that PROC has undertaken before, and I want to build off those and maybe ask some follow-up questions just to narrow down a few different things. You've alluded to this in your opening, but it is the hybrid aspect. It is that extra technology through Zoom and through meetings. That has been the overwhelming increase in workplace injuries or a lot of the anxieties that your staff face, correct?
Mr. President, absolutely. I think the period that, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, I think for all of us, only a few years ago, we had probably no clue what was MS Team or Zoom or even connecting with families and friends and also in the workplace. But also the systems were very different. So I think we've gone a long way. And now I think it's part of the behavior of most of the workplace around the world. I've heard that around 90% of the meeting everywhere now, they have at least one person who's connecting from a different location, despite it could be in town, few blocks away, or it could be at the other end of the country. But we got a lot better to understand, and the companies have also adjusted and make sure that they understand that the quality of sounds. I think you've also recognized that behaviors like when you talk without a microphone, I see more and more people using their headset. Like today, we have people online, they have their headset on. A few years ago, it was not even part of the normal practice. So absolutely, I think we got a lot better.
And with that, just looking at the stats that were in a report from March 2020 to September 2022, the Bureau received 90 incident reports. And by contrast, pre-pandemic, when virtual or remote was not an option, there was one complaint in the 5 years before that. So my point being is, as well, we have an interesting work that we do here. This was brought up at our previous meeting of where it's different than most workplaces in many different ways in the work that we do, in the sense that this is at times at committee adversarial as well. Yes, people have remote work options, but the style or just the organization of meetings and the passions that are here are a bit different as well. Could you just talk and elaborate a bit more? I don't know if you are able to break down a little bit between the different types of hybrid meetings where these injuries are reported, the incidents that happen, if it's an injury or a complaint that is made or a issue that's raised, is it from a technical nature? Was it because multiple people were talking? Do you have those broken down about exactly where the complaints emanated from?
Very good question, Mr. President. I'll try to break that down. Absolutely. The one thing you mentioned what happened before the pandemic. I also said in my opening remark that since the past 10 years, we've been measuring that. I played Canadian football, so if you remember the concussion issues, people are a lot more aware now. So it's similar effect when you get a big loud bang in your ear that could create. So I think the data and the science is getting better and better to understand what happened. Similarly to the concussion, when I was playing, nobody was caring about that. And now I think there's a lot of protocol in place. So the reason why there was no data in the past, maybe just because now they were put under the spotlight under the condition of the pandemic. In terms of the breakdown, I really like the question, Mr. President, because we call them a sound incident. The sound is kind of like the supply chain, but it's a sound chain. So it could be many things. If it's a remote participant like we have today, something can happen in their building, they can lose connectivity, and we can lose sound there. So that might be for us a sound incident that might not cause an injury, or they might not affect the hearing of the interpreter. That being said, they might not be able to interpret if they're not getting the sound. So for us, it's a service and interruption. So we track those. After that, there's I don't know, some of you might have been in meetings in a couple of weeks ago when there was an alert on our phone that was testing the alert system around Canada. So there was a lot of meeting, believe it or not, around Canada. Everybody had their phone, and all of a sudden that big buzz came out. So for an interpreter who were actually actively listening, so it could have created some discomfort and we have measures for that. The case, as we mentioned, we went from 128 in 2022, 78 last year, and now we have 10. The downside of that is the one that we have left are mostly driven by human behavior, is the fact that you bring the earpiece towards the microphone, and that's what they call the Larsen effect. And Larsen effect is basically a fancy name for feedback, the buzz, and it's that sound could be extremely harmful for the hearing. So that's why even we only have a few now. Those are the one that we would really like to prevent, working with our colleagues. So we have the type, and they could be also, I would say, when the sound is super low, they would work, but they can't hear. So it will probably have an effect on them, not as immediate as a Larsen effect, but we're tracking those as well. So they're under the family of sound-related incidents.
And just cognizant of my time, I think I can get one more in. I appreciate the football. That is a good example of maybe the difference that we have to keep confronting here is when you play a football game, everyone's there on the field. Here, when we're trying to do the work, people are at home, they're in an office, they could be wherever, having or not having an approved headset. My question, or my final point maybe be for you to comment on is, I think from the previous studies, the best and safest way for the work that you do is if we are here in person within the room. That can control from a technological, or what you can control is the best. If you're relying on Zoom or other thing, wherever people are, the internet connection, what devices they're using, or the way they're participating in a meeting, the best way still at the end of the day, the safest way for you is if we are in person as much and as best as possible, correct?
Mr. Limber, in about 20 seconds, please.
Yeah, very quickly, I would say it is correct. We really enjoy when it's in person because we do work out of the cabin, but there could be some incident in an in-person setting as well. I will just highlight that, and this is where the Larsen effect happens. Where online, there's a different type of problem. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Duncan. Madame Fortier, 6 minutes à vous.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
For your work that is required every day at a high level of quality and caliber. I have the privilege, of course, of being able to work in both languages, but sometimes I do use the interpretation because it's very important for us to ensure that the information be shared. And I can say that the work is good. So I'd like to come back to this question. We're currently examining the policy of prevention and harassment prevention in the workplace for MPs, and I'd like us to focus on an exercise where we'd like to obtain your ideas, what it is that you would like to see put in place. And I'm wondering if you could describe a scenario, perhaps two scenarios, under which a member's behavior in a committee could harm interpreters. And my second question is whether or not this occurs frequently. That is what I'm trying to understand from you today. Excellent question, Mr. Chair. First of all, I think it's important to specify that we are part of the public administration. We follow the Code of Ethics of the Public Service, and in this code, we also have the Translation Bureau, which belongs to the family of Public Works Canada, and these two codes that were subjected to address workplace harassment and violence prevention, not only with the general public, but with clients, because 90% of the services are delivered to the public, and often we have to deal with both. But today we're focusing on interpretation. We have to say that most interpreters really aren't visible. Sometimes things take place behind the glass, and we have met with committee chairs or liaison chairs where we were able to have discussions with them to have a better communication with them to ensure that when something takes place there, that the committee chair is informed, and the clerk. An example is this. No doubt you've heard about people who were playing around with their earpieces. They were swinging it around. That isn't necessarily voluntary. It might simply be a tick, or in the middle of a debate and people walk around and it's a bit of a tick, and they also fiddle with their pens. That is something that can absolutely impact the interpreter's work, but it also might be perceived perhaps not as a lack of respect, but a lack of understanding of the perils of the Larsen effect. That is why we have the stickers on the tables today. In some cases, we were compelled to interrupt the service, and it has happened online when we had a witness, although they had a good microphone, but there was no sound. Interpreters can't interpret what they can't hear. In that case, we have to suspend the meeting. And then we also hear people say, yes, let's continue, let's go, and sometimes it's a very busy debate, and that has happened. To date, we've been able to have the discussions, and I'd like to turn over to Mr. Ball, since he's also an interpreter. I have another question. Just would you cite an example for us, Mr. Ball? Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, interpreters are aware of the role that they play in the political debate in Canada. We work in an environment that is highly politicized. In addition to political debate, emotions run high. Often people will criticize or be angry if the service is interrupted. But it is something that I feel we manage very well. The interpreters are subjected to a great deal of pressure. But as far as I'm concerned, as being in charge of the service, they know that I'm behind them. I support them if ever they have to interrupt a service. We also have a code of ethics. An interpreter who cannot hear cannot deliver the service and must interrupt the service. We've noted that there has been an increase, at least I've seen this when I came to committees. I was in a committee before I was minister, and now I'm coming back. I see that sometimes there's a certain level of toxicity in the discourse, in the conversations. Would you agree with the fact that there has been an increase? And what is the impact this has on interpreters? How does this enable them or not to do their work? So how can we manage that part? Well, I'll ask Matthew to respond. Mr. Chair, thank you for that question. That's a very interesting question. Truly, I think it would be difficult for me to speak to that, to the sense that the interpreter is your voice. It places himself in your shoes, and you know that more than I do. Your emotions are part of your statements. They're part of the answers you give, but the interpreter is not you. So the interpreter knows how to step away from you as a role, but is there to represent you and speaks in the first person and says I rather than you or he. But I don't think that this is an issue. Yes, but the interpreter as such doesn't necessarily have the attitude or display the behavior of somebody who's speaking very loudly, will not necessarily do that, will not pick up the emotions of an MP. But I take it that in the way of interpreting the words, they do so, but they don't necessarily repeat the mood or their tone. Yes, Mr. Chair, I think it is a good question. Well, there are two schools of thought. With respect to emotions in interpretation, I would say that there's one that is more European, traditional, where you simply deliver the words in a monotone fashion. You don't pick up the emotions of the speaker. But I think right now many clients appreciate hearing interpretation that is more emotional, which conveys the emotions that underlie the words. In fact, I was also a teacher at the University of Ottawa, and I'd say that interpreting is not words, it's ideas behind the words, it's emotions, etc. So I think that it's good for the interpreter to deliver that emotion behind your statements, but we're not in your emotions, we represent them. So perhaps we could delve into that later if I have an opportunity to revisit the issue of what we do now with the School of Thoughts. Would you have any suggestions for our study? Thank you very much, Mrs. Fortier. Ms. Gaudreau, I would like to give you the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to salute my colleagues and interpreters and you. It's very rare that I appear in a hybrid fashion, but given what I've heard, I'd really like to focus with our witness on physical health. We've spoken about this few moments. We've spoken about the Larson effect. And we have just spoken about the interpreter's modulation when things become more emotional. As far as I'm concerned, we're currently assessing the policy on the prevention of harassment and violence vis-a-vis members of parliament. So I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of the interpreter, and you'll be able to give me an answer on that. Do they have to interpret everything? That is, the words that are spoken by members of parliament, whatever they are, whether they be disrespectful or deleterious. Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. Let me give you a beginning of an answer, and of course I'll turn it over to Mr. Ball to continue. There's one thing we want to avoid is that interpreters add words that are not spoken. Again, we've mentioned if they can't hear and they can't interpret. They might have heard something they think, but we don't want them to say things they haven't heard. And when the words are spoken, usually, in some cases at least, it's a summary because things go very quickly. They don't have time. They're looking, they're listening at the same time, so sometimes it's a synthesis. But when it comes to specific words, and perhaps I'll ask Mr. Ball, perhaps he would like to add something to that. Have you seen cases that you recall where certain words were omitted? If I may, Mr. Chair. Yes, it's important that the interpreter translate all of the words that have been spoken. As Ms. Dillenberger just said, it is important not to add words. So there are some important moments during a political discourse. There are non-parliamentary words that are said. The interpreter must render them, because otherwise the people from the other side will not have heard it. The other ones listening in the other language won't have heard them. And recently in the House, we have heard some major decisions taken. So, Mr. Ball, from what I hear, is that there's no policy where there's a restriction on words. That is, the interpreter says it's inaudible for the interpreter. He says that or she says that because they don't want to say the word in the other language. Yes, if the interpreter hears that, they must render it. Well, I'm going to become, let's say I'm an interpreter tomorrow morning and I hear some deleterious, some misogynist wording in the incidents that you've had. How does this play out for interpreters? Because that is collateral damage, and I would like you to be very honest. I'm very concerned. Mr. Chair, I understand the nature of the question. There are a few aspects that I'd like to address. First of all, it's about the intensity of the work. I think recently you saw that our translation volumes for documents, you saw the hours of interpretation, everything is up. And these have to all be done in a quick period of time. And of course, there is a great deal of tension that can be felt during some events, during some meetings. And that's clear. Yeah, I don't have a lot of time. But my question is about mental health. When you must repeat statements that we disagree with, and these run against our values, I understand. I'm also an actor in life. But when you have to put emotion into it, because you've evolved a great deal on that level, and I appreciate it. But how do interpreters feel? Because here we're trying to develop a policy that essentially we impact all of the work. And what are the interpreters saying to you when things really degenerate, when they become terrible? I think things are not running smoothly right now. I understand your question about mental health. What I could add is this. I think the main impact on the interpreters when it comes to mental health is the concern that they're going to experience more than one acoustic incident. And I think as part of their professionalism, they understand that regardless of what the discussion is, whether it be in a committee or question period, that at the end of the day, they're professionals. But they receive a great deal of support. There are a lot of efforts made to sustain health and safety at the office. I think anything having to do with mental health, it's not whether or not today, is that they're worried that there might be an acoustic incident that will impact their hearing. That's really what I see more in affecting their mental health. You have 60 seconds left. I had a minute, but that's fine. 60 minutes is a minute. Sorry about that. Where I'm trying to get at is for the purpose of our study, I think we would need to get a general picture, an internal survey, explaining to us how interpreters experience their work when they are working in a context that is not respectful, where they might hear vexatious statements. I think for the purpose of our study, I think it would be important for us to understand, to obtain these results and to receive these findings from the interpreters as to how they feel. I'm trying to put myself in their place. I know that they're watching me right now, because I'm putting myself in their shoes. And my concern regarding their physical health is that this be a priority. Nevertheless, you come home and you've interpreted, let's say, debates that are disrespectful. I'd like to know more. Would this be possible for you? We at the department, we have services. Very quickly, please. Yes, we do have services that enable us to see whether or not we have gleaned any feedback from our interpreters to that effect. I would also include those doing written translation. It's the same thing for them. And we also have interpreters at the Supreme Court, and there are many cases such as this one. So again, it's a matter of the professionalism of interpreters who are used to working in all kinds of situations. Thank you very much.
Yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I want to continue on that vein. We did hear at the last meeting, the panel, that there are impacts when it's not only interpreting, but when you are part of this institution. And as a former staffer, I was always amazed at how, while I wasn't directly the one in the line of fire per se, there was a great deal of impact. And there's a feeling on the Hill, there's a feeling that gets, excuse the pun, translated down onto others. So I appreciate that there is an attempt to have that separation, that translators do separate themselves, or interpreters do separate themselves, but is there a specific training that comes with that? Is that part of the training in order to become an interpreter?
Monsieur le Président, étant donné que la question ça porte sur la formation.
I would like to turn the question over to Mr. Ball.
Yes, it's part of the interpreter's job to separate themselves from the speech. So as an interpreter, we are all public servants. Our job is to represent your thoughts faithfully and accurately to the listeners in the other language group. And that is part of the training at the university. And yes, interpreters do have to hear sometimes horrific things. Political debate is probably not the worst of things that many interpreters hear. And yes, it's part of the training. Interpreters form a community. They speak to each other afterwards. If there's a particularly difficult meeting, I'm sure, in the booth, I know because I've lived it, they talk amongst themselves and they debrief. And so I would say I'm not overly concerned about their mental health from that perspective. I would agree with my boss, not just because he's my boss, but I think the bigger concerns for them are more around the health and safety stuff. And as Mr. Limburner says, we've made great strides, and I think they're reassured by that. But I think from a mental health standpoint, for us, it's the health and safety that's the greatest. And like I said earlier, most interpreters understand they work in a highly politicized environment, and they are able to separate themselves and what they speak into the microphone from themselves from you. So I'm not overly concerned for that. It's part of the job, and when you become an interpreter, you accept that.
In terms of those supports that you referenced briefly at the end of the last question, in terms of that mental health support, I mean, there certainly is a greater understanding as we move forward, even under the last year or so, of what mental health challenges, impacts are taken on to anybody in any workplace, but specifically this one. So could you go into a bit more detail about how you're ensuring that greater understanding and that evolution of our understanding of mental health, how that's in place for interpreters, and if there's anything that we can do to ensure that it's as within this institution more in line with what is needed?
So, Mr. President, the question is a very good question. So, what we do, as I mentioned in my opening remark, we created a director position for the well-being of interpreters. This is not something that was ever done in the history of the Translation Bureau. So, we've put somebody in place whose only focus is on that, and part of the well-being is definitely the mental health. So, it goes through many types. So, we have numerous discussion. We meet them, we bring them together to get their feedback, and we're making sure that we have plans to improve our services. Maybe I would like to highlight we do 50,000 hours of interpretation every year for the Parliament, which is tremendous. And there's a lot of things that are going well. But again, it's that prediction of any type of incident. What I would say that's causing the most stress right now when you walk into work, if you would walk to work and you don't know if today something's going to happen to you, it creates some anxiety. But it's not the only thing. The relationship with our colleague in the House of Commons and at the Senate is paramount. Doing what we do is a team sport, because there's many people that are not even from the same organization that all come together in order to support what we're doing here. But we're paying a lot of attention. I mentioned the ombudsman or the ombud of PSPC, which is amazing services that they can go and talk to. But in addition, because of what happened, and of course that we have also instruction from Labour Canada, it's very serious. So we want to make sure that everybody understands what we're doing, and being transparent and having a discussion is our main tool.
In terms of how members can be better about this, our improvements. I think of certain instances, and it may, I mean, I certainly have seen, I play with a pen, I know some play with their earphones, but there are instances, specific members who purposely scream into their mics in the House of Commons for it's a shtick, it's their effect. What do you do in those instances? How do you deal with that? Is there a protocol? Has that been used in these particular instances?
So, Mr. President, part of our measures that we've put in place, so the sound is controlled behind the window as well. So we're trying to put everything that we can in order to mitigate those situations. Interpreters can also adjust the volume that they need to work with, for sure. So it is maybe Matthew, do you want to add anything around when they?
Briefly, Mr. Chair, if you will. Our goal is not to hamper your debate. Our goal is not to impede on how members of Parliament work. The instructions, the directions that have been put in place, we understand that they're having an impact on maybe how MPs feel about the service, but really, we've directed interpreters to make sure that they look after their health and safety. So if someone's yelling in the microphone, obviously they need to turn the volume down. We understand that at the end of the day, probably MPs believe it's more important to have healthy interpreters that can continue to support them and it can make sure that the capacity is there rather than maybe missing a word because the volume was turned down. So we're there to support them and to make sure they work as safely as possible.
Okay, thank you, Madame Matheson. Monsieur Berthold, vous avez 5 minutes.
Mr. Berthold, 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In 5 minutes. That's not a great deal of time. First of all, so I would wish to congratulate you for the 90th anniversary, also for the mandatory translation of debates. I think that's very important, especially for Quebecers such as myself. The 89% of the time is spent in I speak French most of that time in the House and in committees, so I want my colleagues to understand what I'm saying. I was very pleased to learn about this new way of seeing interpretation and to ensure that interpreters are also able to convey emotion. I've had the opportunity of being at international meetings and to listen to the European-style interpretation, and I can say that when you include excerpts from our debates, these are much more interesting. It's much more interesting when you hear some emotion. I'm not saying that it has to be extreme, but that you hear the interpreters including emotion. They're doing a great job. I'd like to thank them for that. I also used to be an MP who used to speak very, very quickly, and I think that I've substantially reduced the pace of my speech by understanding the work of the interpreters. Because specifically, I've had an opportunity of speaking with some of them at times, and I understand that if from 135 words a minute, I've really reduced the rhythm, and I think that was greatly appreciated by all. So allow me to say that you're doing an excellent job. So how many complaints have you received regarding interpretation from MPs? I don't know. I'd say over the last 5 years. Mr. Chair, thank you very much for those comments and also what you said about the Translation Bureau. Since I've come into office, the emphasis was greatly placed on acoustic incidents. But as well, we've also had many discussions to speak either about preferences or certain comments, and there are very few, I'd say. I've had comments from people who really appreciate these new earpieces and people who don't like it at all. So it's quite difficult to balance. So I know that we can't speak at the same time. I'll let you finish. Well, what I'd like to say is this. Have you received any official complaints regarding the work of interpreters by MPs? We've had some official complaints about the translation of documents where there are mistakes. Now, regarding the interpretation, and again, that's where I'll turn it over to Mr. Ball. Perhaps he could cite some examples. Sometimes it's the tone of voice. Some interpreters might be speaking more loudly than another. I hear that often, but it's similar to that. It's nothing major. I think that we're one of the best in the world, and our exam is very difficult to pass. But again, it's a matter of preference, and it's like audiobooks. Some people like it, others find it boring. Also, it really depends on each person's preference. And sometimes it's tough, and that's what I'm trying to explain, is that we're trying to have a conversation, and we're not trying to speak one over the other. But I'm trying to lead you somewhere. I don't want to interrupt you, but sometimes we have no other choice. And that's one of the issues that we're also seeing as an MP when we're working with a witness, and the witness is in front of us, and the witness takes a bit of time, and that isn't what you've done, but that really illustrates what the conversation can be. I really want us to speak about that relationship. So there were no complaints about harassment or anything of that nature by MPs regarding the interpreters. Now, first of all, have the interpreters submitted any complaints regarding MPs without naming any names, without establishing any links here, but have there been complaints about harassment or subjects surrounding harassment? To my knowledge, Mr. Chair, there have not been any official complaints, but as I've indicated, we also have the Code of Ethics, really fosters official, formal dispute resolution when there's a perception that one has not been heard. And you'll often see people are in the car, and an interpreter said, I can't hear the witness, and people in the room say, but I do hear them. And in that sense, they sometimes feel that their judgment has not been respected. But in terms of an official complaint, I don't think so. But Annie, do you have anything to say about that? In fact, no, I'm not familiar with any official complaints having been submitted. The interpretation work is not easy, as we just heard from Mr. Limburner. Interpreters must call constantly on their own judgment to see whether or not they can interpret or not. And I can reassure you that all interpreters come to work with the wish to interpret. It's never wonderful for an interpreter to have to cut somebody off and say, look, I cannot interpret you because I can't hear you. They don't do this because they enjoy doing it. I can guarantee that, but in terms of official complaints, I'm not aware of any. Mr. Berthold, unfortunately, your 5 minutes are up. Those are all the time you have. Yes. Yes, one more. I'd like to say thank you. Thank you very much for your work. And I worked for a long time in the sound industry as a DJ, as a radio host in the evening. I've always worked in a sound environment, so I understand that it's so important to have good equipment, and especially when it comes to these little earpieces, it's very tight when you are wearing glasses. I'd just like to point that out.
À vous pour 5 minutes.
Ms. Romanado, 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Puis, je veux remercier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here this morning.
Thank you to the interpreters for doing what they do. And rest assured, when I was a chair of a committee, that if there was a sound issue, we stopped the committee. The committee did not go forward if we couldn't secure the sound for the interpreters to ensure the work that they do. I want to follow up a little bit on some of what my colleague MP Matheson was talking about. In this place, interpreters spend their day being our voice. And some MPs, and it happens, whether it be in the House or in committee, will get very passionate about what they're talking about. Some will scream in the mic. Some will argue amongst each other. And so you have the words that are being interpreted that are sometimes not the most pleasant, whether it be the sound quality, very loud, or fighting amongst each other. But there's also sometimes the subject matter. I've sat on the Veteran Affairs Committee where we would hear horrifying testimony. Some of the studies that we undertake, status of women, hearing horrific testimony that the interpreters, and they are very professional, please don't think that, but at the end of the day, they're going home and they're having to replay what they heard and what they had to say. And I think that's where we're trying to go, is to say the words that we are using, whether it be in tone, in sound, and the actual words, some of the things that they are hearing has to have an impact on them. I mean, I can get up and walk out of debate in the House if it's getting a little testy for me. They can't. So I think that's where we're going with this, is to understand how what we're using, the words we're using and how we use them, how is that impacting them? And have you had any complaints or people saying, look, I can't do that committee anymore. It's too heavy for me. Has that ever happened?
So, Mr. President, it hasn't happened since I joined the Translation Bureau, but what I would like to maybe elaborate, today there's 3 people in the booth or 2 people. So they are also replacing one another in the course of a conversation, and sometimes they would focus on something else. So maybe they won't have the entire view. I mean, just from an energy perspective, when you get into a room and there's something heavy, I mean, everybody's affected, of course. We can understand that. But as part of their the mental health, I mean, we've spent so much focus on their well-being that there's possibility for them to voice those concerns. It's not something that we take lightly. Of course, recently the emphasis seems to be on the physical, but I don't think we never let down the impact on their mental health. The scheduling is extremely tight as well. Some of your committees are going overtime, over midnight, so they're extremely well trained around that type of very intense short period of time that we're into. And then after that, they have other measures over the summer to kind of get ready. So maybe I'll ask Matthew on that part of the screaming, because again, that's something that we have limiters for sounds behind the scene, so that will cut off if a sound is going too high. Maybe you want to elaborate on that.
If I may, Mr. Chair, it's a very interesting question, and it is something we are aware of. It is a phenomenon known as secondary or vicarious trauma, and interpreters do experience it. We have the Chief Interpreter for Canada behind us here, and she's part of a network of worldwide heads of interpreting services, and this is something that's discussed at these tables. So it is something we're certainly aware of, but I'd just like to reassure the committee members that in terms of Parliament, interpreters who work for Parliament understand the cut and thrust of the debate. They understand that it's, I would say even members themselves probably understand that sometimes, you put it on a little, it's a little dramatic, it's a show, and sometimes it's very authentic and genuine, and that's part of the job. And I think that all of our staff and all of our freelance interpreters understand this very well. I'm not overly concerned about vicarious or secondary trauma. Like Mr. Limburner said, the bigger concern for me is that they feel safe and that they feel that it's a healthy work environment. And also Mr. Limburner alluded to this, it's a team sport. So I've been in the booth when I've had to interpret stuff that's emotional, and sometimes you just have to take a break, and so there's 3 people in the booth to support you.
So I'm out of time, but I wanted to thank you for that. And we will, as you've trained us or taught us about the importance of good sound hygiene, and we want to also keep in mind that the words that we're using can also hurt, in a sense, not just the person receiving it, but the person actually having to translate it. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Romanado. Madame Gaudreau, malheureusement, c'est seulement 2 minutes 30 secondes pour vous, mais la parole est à vous.
Mrs. Gaudreau, you have very limited time. There was a little bit of a lag, so I do know it is my turn. Once again, congratulations for the interpretation, because right now I didn't hear the chair's words, so I inferred that it was my turn. How many people have left the Interpretation Bureau over the last decade? Well, let me give you a sense of the volume. We have about 70 interpreters who are staff interpreters who support the 50,000 hours of interpretation I mentioned. We also hire freelance interpreters. It's about 100 interpreters. It's a very limited pool, not only in Canada but worldwide. There are retirements. Have some people taken early retirement because of the conditions that were in place the last few years? That's possible. But in terms of actually having resigned, I will turn it over to Mr. Ball to speak to that. Mr. Chair, thank you for that question. Now, resignations, there haven't been any. We have a pool of about 60 staff interpreters who do other things. Some are asked to do translation for some periods for a number of reasons. It's hard for me to say. Well, that is what I would like to know. What are the reasons? Some people go into translation for certain times of their lives. Perhaps they have they're new parents, or perhaps they'd like to work a more regular schedule. I don't have the exact figures, but some people move on to other duties and they come back to interpretation later. Perhaps we could find some numbers. Well, essentially what I'm trying to understand as part of the trauma, the interpretation, the briefings, etc., I'm trying to What is it that you don't hear because you don't work closely to them? I want to hear from them. But when they finish their jobs, what kind of topics do they speak about? Do they talk about what they'll be doing the weekends or the statements that they've had to, the speeches that they've had to interpret? Well, if I may, it really depends. It depends on the individuals. It depends on the group. Sometimes people will be speaking about the meeting that has just ended, but I take it that most of the time they'll be speaking about the weekend or about their children or about their plans for tonight. Those are my questions, Mr. Chair.
Oui, rapidement.
Oui, rapidement.
Well, there are other reasons. There are working conditions. Again, a reminder that throughout the pandemic, the interpreters always came to work here. Now they receive offers for people to work remotely. There are many different reasons why they do this. These are very difficult conditions. They work long hours. They work on site. But I think they're passionate and in their work, and they're proud of their work. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
2.5 minutes to you.
So again, you've spoken a lot about the new policies that are in place, the new rules, the spacing out of members, placement of earpieces. It's all very, very important. These are important changes for your workplace, but within an institution that we heard at the last committee meeting that, steeped in tradition, may be resistant to change, and maybe used like barriers could be seen, or that resistance through parliamentary privilege or things like that. So how can we in this committee take lessons that you've learned in terms of applying those rules, creating that change that you need so that we can also create a healthier, safer, more functional workplace?
I'll be quick, but Mr. President, so many measures that are to respond to the instruction that we got were very technical, as you mentioned. Some of those were put in place all at the same time. So I just want to reassure everyone that we're working with our colleague to see if there's some measures that we could that we could adjust. Just a couple of weeks ago, the opening statement by the president of every committee was very long. Now it's a little bit shorter. We feel that people understand the distanciation, but again, if there's some possibility to use new technology to limit the impact on you, because we understand that it could create some frustration. I would go back when everybody speak at the same time. That's probably the one that I hear the most. That is very difficult because there's a lot of voice coming in and to really do a good work. That's one piece that I hear a lot. So that's one. And again, if there's a service interruption, maybe just to make sure that everybody understand, there's ways for people to get the information quickly. Sometimes it's coming behind the window. Other time it is coming from the sound system. But just maybe to respect the fact that everybody wants to get going with the procedure and be respectful on that sense. I would say that. The last one is for those online. We're able to send headset around the world in a very short time. And it's those headsets are being approved. They're ISO headset. It's in some very remote area of the world sometime, and we're being very good, and we can conduct tests ahead of time for your witness so they can use better headset for our own work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Berthold, 5 minutes.
Mr. Berthold, for 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to take that last 5 minutes because I hadn't quite finished. 2 points. If I understood your comments following all of the questions, is that the interpreters essentially, they don't want to take part in the debate, nor do they want to change the debate or the tenor of the discussion. What they seek to do is to render the debate exactly as to those listening to them. Yes, and in a very, very quick timeline. An interpreter comes in 4 or 5 seconds after. It's very difficult to do this. Not only do you have to, as Mr. Ball mentioned, respect the emotions of the meeting. That is the Canadian version of interpretation. It's very good, but you have to be very quick to execute in real time. So the pride of interpreters, because I was told this at the beginning when I came in, I was not familiar with this, and I understood that these are not translators, they're interpreters. And this is one of the first interactions I had with interpreters, because I had spoken about translate, and I was told, Mr. Berthold, we don't do translation. What we do is interpretation. so that people understand it's because the words aren't the same in the other language, and emotion as well might be the same. So I find that extremely interesting. So, Ms. Trépanier, when we're elected for the first time as an MP, we receive training as well. Are you considering providing a new training session to MPs about interpretation and how this works? Is that something that could be considered? I think that would be desirable because I worked as I went along. When I was elected as an MP, I learned how to work with interpreters. Do you think that this is something that this committee might recommend? Well, I'll turn it over to Mrs. Trépanier, but we have taken part in a number of training sessions with our colleagues from the Privy Council when it came to a change in government or what happens when other ministers come in. So no doubt this would concern our colleagues in House here. I think it would be good perhaps to have a sheet to explain the basic concepts. But Ms. Trépanier, thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. And I think that, in fact, that is an excellent idea. I think, no doubt, as my CEO has indicated, there are documents that exist, but having a training session would be very relevant. I thank you for the suggestion. And that would be a practical training with the interpreters to see what kind of work they do and to experience what happens in their box where they are. Because it is when you're living it and when you're interested in people who do the work that we're able to better understand it, to do our work better, all the while respecting the work of the interpreters. Thank you very much. We've also posted some online videos to familiarize people with what takes place on the other side of the glass and about the very specialized work done by interpreters, and we're going to continue with that. Now, from a technical standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, I have a bit of experience with respect to sound because I worked in the field. There are sound limitators that limit the extreme sound spikes. And I've seen places here where you cannot open more than microphone anywhere. I've seen that elsewhere, but that's not the case here. Everybody has their own microphone. Is that something that you're considering from a technical standpoint? What is the Translation Bureau's plan for the next few months and years? Mr. Chair, I'm not an interpreter. I'm an industrial engineer, and I have studied in the field as well. We're looking at a number of technical measures. You've mentioned the earpieces. It's possible that when somebody takes the earpiece immediately, it might cause a problem in sound. But there's also the digital sound. We have less of a Larsen effect when it's digital sound. So people joining us on Zoom today, that really reduces the danger. The danger is when we're in an acoustic environment that is more analog in nature. So that is another area that we are verifying. You might as well have been in concerts where the singers have earpieces, but that is it's inside their ear. That's truly a difference, and this is why the Larsen effect is greatly reduced. Here we want the earpieces to be used by a number of people. That's required, so perhaps we would develop specific earpieces for you, and you could use them. But we are working with colleagues. We're not responsible for the audiovisual component. We have actual beings, human beings, interpreters who come in the room with us. We also work with the teams to identify the technical tools that might completely eliminate the Larsen effect. We're studying these because we want to eliminate any interruptions for you, of course. There are only a few seconds left. Yes, but you've been successful in doing an excellent job because moving from 128 to 10 in only 3 years, well, I commend you for that. Hats off. It's a matter of human behavior. We work in that, and it's always the last mile that's the toughest. That's where we are.
Monsieur Berthaud, je pense au début du réunion.
And Mr. Berthaud, I think at the beginning of the meeting, I also mentioned translation. I'd like to correct that and use the word of interpretation. Thank you.
Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief because I know we have very limited time. Just two things. Mr. Ball, I know that you mentioned that there's not a lot of injuries or complaints with respect to vicarious or secondary trauma. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to maybe survey the interpreters to see if that is something that is a problem, and I would suggest maybe you do, because I would anticipate that there are maybe some people who are having to deal with that. And the other thing I would say, we didn't talk about, but I have seen in debate, especially in committee, MPs that slam their hand down or are banging on the desk to make a point. I anticipate that also can injure. Is that correct?
So maybe I'll just, Mr. President, I'll pick the last one, loud bang, which is not a Larfin effect, could definitely have an impact on interpreters. It could be a laptop dropping down, a microphone dropping down, or somebody banging on the table. Absolutely. In terms of the Sicarius effect, maybe, Matthew?
Sure, thank you for the question. We work really closely with the union. There's a professional association representing the freelance interpreters. I would say the Bureau management is very open and constantly working with them to ensure that issues are addressed as they come up. And to echo my boss's sentiments from earlier, the biggest issue facing the staff and freelance interpreters right now, it's the matter of the health and safety and the sound quality. And so we're working really closely on that. But absolutely, we're always open. We've actually done a workplace evaluation recently, so we'll be getting the results from that as well. So if there's vicarious trauma issues, it will come up in that report, which we're expecting soon. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it. Merci.
Thank you, Ms. Romanado. Colleagues, we are going to suspend briefly in order to set up for the next panel. Typically, we've been inserting some health breaks into our meetings in order to allow for people to move around a little bit, catch their breath. So I'm going to give us a generous couple of minutes here in order to turn over, because we do still have a couple of more hours to go this morning. One thing, colleagues, that I did want to raise that could be helpful, and I know it might be a little bit difficult to adjust to, but in order to assist in all of us knowing how much time is remaining in our speaking order, and I note that Madame Gaudreau did this earlier, it is helpful to have you time yourself and to have that clock in front of you. That accomplishes two things. One, there's no discrepancy between the clock with the chair and members, but also it means that I don't have to interrupt and perhaps allows for a more seamless meeting. So I make that recommendation. I know it might take a little bit of time for us to implement, but I think it could be helpful. With that, Mr. Ball, Mr. Limburner, Madame Trépanier, merci beaucoup d'être ici avec nous ce matin.
Thank you very much for having been with us today.
For a few minutes, and we'll be back for our second panel. Colleagues, in our second panel, we are welcoming two members of Parliament, our colleagues Ikra Khalid and Pam Damoff, who are going to be sharing some testimony. I do want to start by offering a little bit of a trigger warning. I understand that we'll be discussing some things that are related to abuses that have either been experienced directly by people around this table or by extension. And I know that for those watching, some of the language or the retelling of stories may be disconcerting and triggering. So for colleagues around the table, for staff in the room, if there is any assistance that is required, you are most certainly at any point welcome to see myself or the clerk if we can be of help. I know that there will be a number of difficult topics that are raised, not only by our colleagues across the way, but by other members around the table as well. So I just, as a courtesy, wanted to offer that before we begin. Ms. Rempel-Garner, I see you out of the corner of my eye, so I'll turn to you momentarily.
Chair, sometimes when there is testimony that has become in front of committee that might have trauma sensitivities, there is the option for witnesses to go in camera. I understand that they might not want to, but I would just put that on the table as well, too.
I appreciate that, and I do hope that should we get to a point where witnesses do feel that we need to move in camera, that there won't be any disagreement on the part of committee members to seek the unanimous consent we would need in order for that to happen. So thank you, Ms. Rempel-Garner, for sharing that. Ms. Khalid, I am going to turn to you. Oh, sorry, Ms. Damoff, I'm going to turn to you to begin with your opening statement. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the invitation to appear today. And I'm going to apologize in advance if I get emotional. I'm deeply troubled by the serious implications that increasing harassment and threats have for the safety of MPs and our staff, for the ability of MPs to fulfill our roles, and ultimately for the integrity of Parliament and the long-term sustainability of our democracy. While I worked for over 25 years in real estate investment banking, which was a male-dominated industry, and certainly experienced some misogyny and harassment in my previous career, it doesn't come anywhere close to what I've experienced as an MP. The level of threats and misogyny I'm subject to both online and in person are such that I often fear going out in public, and that is not a sustainable or a healthy way to live. I've been verbally assaulted in the grocery store in my community with a man yelling, "F Trudeau, F you, you're going to jail for what you've done." And at a Burlington business event, when a man aggressively said to me, watch my back, and that I was going to get what was coming to me as he pointed his finger in my face. The toxic drive for social media likes and clips among elected officials has hindered constructive conversations, exasperated differences between us, and diminished our capacity to show empathy towards each other. In emails, calls, and on social media, one of the clearest examples of this degradation of political discourse is the increasing use of a four-letter derogatory term starting with C that I am not comfortable repeating here in Parliament. But you know, in all of my life prior to becoming an MP, both personally and professionally, I have never been called this word before. But during my time as an MP, it has become completely normalized among the public to use this word to label and degrade me and my fellow women MPs. Today I want to share with the committee and with Parliament and with Canadian excerpts of communications I personally received during my time as an MP through email, by phone, and on social media. And I also want you to think of my incredible staff who are being subjected to this abuse on the phone and reading what people say. This has real negative consequences for their mental health and for the ability of MPs to continue to hire and retain staff. And I want to be clear that while I'm going to use specific examples of the actions of some Conservative MPs, I do not want to suggest in any way that this reflects all Conservative MPs. In fact, this pin I am wearing today was a gift from a Conservative MP, and I have friends across the aisle. I think it bears mentioning that there are many, many more examples than I have chosen to share with you today, but because the words used are far below the dignity of Parliament, I'm not going to repeat them here. Some examples include, and I'm going to quote, I really don't know how you sleazy liberal C-words live with yourselves. Good luck in the next election, you piece of shit. I'm coming after you. That was it. You're done. How are you in government? You deserve a pig shed, you effing piece of shit. We're watching your every move. Nowhere is safe for you. God will make sure you are exposed on Judgment Day. Judgment is here. The hellfire God has waiting for you will burn you. End quotes. Even following my announcement on May 1st that I would not be reoffering, precisely because of the harassment, misogyny, abuse, and explicit threats of violence I received, dozens of hate-filled messages flooded in. For example, and again I'm quoting, "Resign now, you stupid effing cow. Don't wait. Run and hide, libtard effing bitch. Good riddance, C-word. Politics, as you call it, is toxic because your party and government is a corrupt, disgusting sack of shit. If you, C-words, had governed like human beings, the country would not hate your corrupt, fascist C-words. Do better, you stupid C-word." And then lastly, you're a sad excuse of an MP and worse excuse of a Canadian. May your life be filled with stress and anxiety. May you never know peace in your wretched days. May you live and die alone in a dark, cold place. Burn in hell, C-word. The tone and tenor of public discourse has deteriorated so significantly and to such a degree that I fear the loss of trust in public institutions we're seeing, driven by misinformation and lies being spread by politicians on social media, and the outcomes, I worry about the outcome of this for our democracy. Members of Parliament must understand that they drive and exasperate harassment, abuse, and threats received by other MPs when they spread misinformation and lies and make personal attacks against other members. This has been my case and the case of many of my colleagues. One example was in 2018 when Conservative MP Rachel Thomas used her House of Commons budget, which was taxpayer dollars, to send a mailer to every household in my riding with the headline that said, quote, "MP Pam Demoff fails to stand up for victims of rape and sex trafficking. And Pam Demoff chooses ISIS over women and girls." The first line of this mailer basically claims, quote, "The current government is committed to welcoming ISIS terrorists back to Canada," end quote. We often hear Conservative MPs carelessly and baselessly using terms like corrupt and treason in Parliament and in their social media posts. Following Conservative MPs Michael Barrett, Michael Cooper, Larry Brock, and Damien Currick accusing government members of the Ethics Committee of being corrupt, and MP Barrett accusing me personally of being involved in a cover-up, Conservative MPs posted our email addresses on social media, encouraged the public to contact us. As a result, my staff had to create a misogyny subfolder in my inbox, and some of the messages that I received as a result were, and I'm going to quote with all of these, "You are one sleazy effing lying C-word. Enough is enough of you effing lying pieces of shit. How do you sleep? I know your ex-husband sleeps well now that he got rid of you. Resign from the party, resign from Oakville. You disgusting piece of shit. Nice legacy. Pathetic losers, you need to go to jail. You bitches are effed. You are an effing traitor. Get the F out of Canada before we deal with you properly. You are a treasonous piece of garbage." These are all different messages, by the way. It's not the same one. "You are a treasonous piece of garbage. You should be in prison for supporting the destruction of our country and people. You are a criminal." Another one said, "Your beloved boss is going to stand in front of the Nuremberg tribunals, as should all of you. You disgusting, pathetic, Satanist-worshipping humans, and you're all finished." And then the last one, "You are an arrogant, elite, and unhinged bitch. You're going to rot in maximum security when the revolution comes. I suggest you step down now while you can, traitor." While I have been the target of the gun lobby for many years and received far more than just mean tweets, as they call them, I want to give another specific example of an MP's comments directly causing an influx of hate through social media, emails, and phone calls. During clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-21, Conservative MP Blaine Calkins posted a video accusing me of equating hunters with the Danforth shooter, which I absolutely did not. As a result of his video, some of the threats and abuse that I immediately got were, quote, "You stupid C word, it's up to the government to justify taking away legal property, not the person to keep it, and fear is not a justification. I hope and pray to God that you will die a horrible, painful death, and your family too, because you and your genes are a piece of shit and need to be removed from the planet. Come on, God, answer my prayer. She is a liberal, whore, and a waste of human skin." Another one said, "In medieval times, this would be considered treason, and it would be off with your head and hung from the gates." Another one, "Well, look at this lying liberal sack of shit. Go F yourself, Pam. Go F yourself, Pam, preferably with this semi-automatic assault rifle dildo and with an accompanying photo that he sent." And then the last one, even if you sucked my cock, I wouldn't vote for you." While I report explicit threats of violence towards me to police, they often say they don't cross the line for them to do anything. I note that the RCMP Commissioner recently said we should look at giving police additional tools and legislation to adequately respond to threats against politicians, and I believe he's testifying before the committee, and I look forward to his testimony. I agree with those arguing that a healthy dose of partisanship and criticism of the government are inherent to this place and have always been core tenets of Parliament and a healthy democracy. But what I have experienced and what many other parliamentarians and our staff have experienced does not constitute legitimate criticism of government policy, nor a healthy debate of ideas. I'm deeply worried about our Parliament and our democracy should this continue unabated. And while it may be difficult to control the words and conduct of others, I believe it is our collective responsibility as parliamentarians to set the tone and an example through how we interact and debate with each other and to rise above personal attacks and hostility. At minimum, we need to call out inappropriate behavior in our own political parties and a harassment and abuse by MPs towards other MPs. I'm heartened by the Halton women elected representatives who recently signed a public pledge to stand up for one another and to call on police to do more to combat abuse and threats towards elected officials. Parliamentarians are called to conduct our work with civility, compassion, and respect. Respect for each other, for our position, for our office, for the legislative process, and for the institution of Parliament and Canadians. It is not lost on me how the difficult challenges that we face, the issues we have to overcome, and divisions we have to heal. However, I believe Canada can represent the best in each of us if we as parliamentarians do our part. I want to again thank the committee for the opportunity to appear today, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Madame Dama, for sharing some very difficult experiences with us. Ms. Khalid, the floor is yours for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, for inviting me to appear before the PROC Procedure and House Affairs Committee today to speak about the review of the members of the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy. I apologize in advance if my voice shakes today. It will shake, but it will not be silenced. I will not be bullied. I will not be intimidated. I will continue to represent my constituents to the best of my ability. Mr. Chair, I want to begin by acknowledging the brave woman sitting beside me on this panel, MP Pam Dumoff, who has done so much to bring the issue of harassment and threats of members of Parliament, particularly women, to the forefront of the conversation that is so critically important to speak about right now. And it's important because it is literally the core value of our democracy here as Canadians. Are we able to disagree without being disagreeable? Are we going to save what democracy looks like for our younger generations coming forward? If we are not able to stop the harassment of each other in the name of partisan politics, we are not going to survive as a democracy. Our next generation is going to be completely disengaged, disenfranchised, and will have no trust in democratic institutions at all. And I think that this is very, very vital for us to recognize.
I had a class of constituents last week, 2 weeks ago, up in the gallery, and they watched question period. And when I met with them after they had experienced that, the first question that one of the young girls said to me, she asked, "Is it always this violent in there? How do you do it? Why do you do it?" And my answer to her was, because we need to make sure that we are having positive, constructive discourse with one another so that we can represent and support Canadians as they deserve. We are elected, all 338 of us, in our ridings by the people, the communities that live there. We represent them. And, Mr. Chair, I am embarrassed by how our conduct is deteriorating the very values that we stand for. And I do have a few examples for you today, Mr. Chair. Have you ever been called a racial slur for just doing your job? Have you been called a terrorist casually as if it were your name? Have you ever been spat on before? I have. Somebody once said to me, "I want to fuck you gently with a chainsaw." Imagine the violence, the thought of it even, to utter those thoughts and make it public, put it on record. How do people feel that they have the entitlement to do that? Harassment for me has not been new. I've been elected as a member of parliament for 9 years, and it has been from day one. But I will highlight a few of the incidents specific to this topic of MPs harassing each other and creating, for me in particular, life-threatening situations. In 2017, I had tabled Motion 103 in the House, which was a motion to combat all types of systemic racism and religious discrimination, including Islamophobia, in our country. It was an attempt to build bridges between communities. Unfortunately, there was a conservative leadership race that was ongoing at the time, and the members of that leadership race started to, through the use of alt-right media, first off, legitimize a concept that I was bringing in Sharia law into the country, and that this was not a non-binding motion, but a first step, a bill, which was quite wrong and very false and maliciously false. These emails were circulated across the country. They were used to raise fundraising dollars for conservative candidates in that conservative leadership race. The end result was multiple death threats, which were investigated by police. Police were stationed outside of my house for weeks. My staff were harassed to the point where we had to lock our office doors. We received over 90,000 emails in my inbox, preventing me from doing any of my other constituency work. All of that happened because Conservative MPs running for leadership felt that this was a plug. The politics of agitation is not helpful to how we conduct ourselves as Canadians and as parliamentarians. We need to put Canadians first and foremost. As I said, I've received, other than the verbal abuse, death threats, including from a gentleman inviting me to become acquainted with his rifle, and another who told me that I would be hanged, another who released my address on a radio talk show to say, "Go kill her. I would happily film it if you go kill her." When MPs target each other on social media, when the politics of agitation gets pushed by right-wing media, we are doing indirectly what we cannot do directly according to the House of Commons rules. We are bullying and intimidating each other for partisan politics, and that is not fair to Canadians at all. We embarrass ourselves in front of Canadians. We can dance around the antics of social media posts all we want, but the intent of these social media posts, of sending letters like my colleague MP Pam Dumoff received in her writing, it is harassment, and we need to do something about it. As I've said, many Conservative members, and not all of them, including the now leader of the opposition, have done similar things to target individual members of Parliament, to bully and to harass and to silence. And what that has done is that it has divided communities now more than ever, and some communities more than others. There are real-world consequences when members of Parliament decide to fundraise and get clicks off of dehumanizing others with insults and with attacks. And I'm not the only target. Just this past week, we heard from the Sergeant of Arms, who testified at PROC, that the harassment of MPs, especially online, has increased by about 700 to 800%. This is not new, and this should not be normalized. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, there must be room in Canada for people to legitimately criticize their elected representatives, their policies, and their positions to further the productive democratic discourse in this country. There must also be room for members of Parliament to engage in discourse, for the opposition to do its job, and for the government to do theirs. What we are seeing, however, are the boundaries being blurred with intimidation, harassment, and outright threats and violence layered with misogyny against us as parliamentarians to prevent us from fulfilling our duties to our constituents. There must be a clear distinction and boundary between legitimate criticism and outright harassment that is made clear in your forthcoming study and report in the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy, specifically between members of Parliament, and specifically when it comes to women and our unique experiences. Let me say, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Chair, that people are watching. Canadians are watching us, and we need to do better. We need to make sure that there is respect in this place, because if we don't respect each other, how can we expect Canadians to respect each other? How can we continue to build bridges amongst each other? And how can we stand for a democracy that is built on respect? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms. Khaled. Colleagues, I just want to check with the witnesses quickly. If, given the nature and the sensitivity of the topic, do you feel ready to go right into a line of questioning, or would? Okay. With that, Ms. Rempel-Garner, you will begin our first round with 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to say, based on personal experience, that that the type of language that you both have been subjected to by members of the public, it's unacceptable, right? I think that's something that we all can agree on. And I think the question now is, how do we move forward? So, as a member of the opposition, it is my job to hold the government to account. And so for me, when I come into the House of Commons sometimes, and I've asked the Prime Minister questions, I will state a fact that's in a report, and then he'll stand up in the House of Commons and say that I'm spreading misinformation. So how are we, because you've both had good suggestions. You've said that we need to allow for room for legitimate criticism of the government. But how can we do that when we have a Prime Minister who stands up over and over again, and many of the ministry as well, when there's a legitimate concern, rather than defending the policy, or it's just there's misinformation, Conservatives are spreading misinformation, and do you think that that also degrades the environment that happens in question period that Ms. Khaled described?
Thank you for the question. And I remember a debate that you and I had, Ms. Rempel-Garner, some time ago in a late show. I think it was quite emotional for both of us, talking about this very issue and how we could all rise above. And I think it's incumbent on every single one of us to frame our questions in a way that are respectful, but also frame answers in a way that's respectful. I feel like I always do try to do that. I'm not going to try and make this partisan about the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition, because I really want to talk about how we as individuals can rise above.
On that, I'm not going to get into tu quo cui here, like who did what. You didn't name a lot of people. I do think that I have not shared my experiences because I don't want that to be my Google search. I'm not saying that sharing the experience is invalid, but we need to drive to solutions here. And number one, I would just respectfully ask that, going back to your caucus, maybe say, like, when the opposition asks for information, the line "that is misinformation" is not productive. One. Two. A lot of this has to do, a lot of me behind the scenes, and I don't want to share my experience publicly, but I've actually had scenarios where charges have been laid and somebody has been released on bail immediately and then disappeared. And then these were death threats. So I have to walk around wondering where this person is. Do you think bail reform to prevent, because we know that like online harassment, and it's not just us, it's every woman in the country, right? Like when the RCMP said MPs need more protection, I'm like, if they can't protect me, how do they protect everyone else? And we know that women see escalation in this type of violence. Do you think that the sort of catch and release policy that allows people where there's repeated harassment to just be released on bail, and then in some instances murder or commit violence against women, do you think that that should be reformed?
If I may, first and foremost, through you, Chair, I acknowledge the hard work and the integrity of Ms. Rempel Garner. I know how much she goes through on a regular basis, and whether you can share it or not, I acknowledge it, and I'm very, very sympathetic towards it. I think the study of why we're here today is about the conduct between members of Parliament. And I think that it would be great if we could provide solutions on that specifically. And the one that I had proposed in my opening
on that,
remarks,
have either of you received or pressed charges for criminal harassment against any other member of Parliament?
No.
Okay. So then I think a lot of what I've heard and where this comes from is online harassment from the general public, bots, we don't know. So how do we get to a solution on that? Because frankly, I'm tired of the perpetual story I've had for 15 years, which is how do you live with violence against women in politics? I'm sure you both feel the same way. So let's go to solutions. I'm suggesting bail reform. I'd like to get in other areas as well, too, like the fact that repeated harassment, the government hasn't moved to look at any sort of way where repeated harassment, that there's no tools for law enforcement to perhaps get the identity of somebody online. It's a slow and onerous process that allows for escalation of violence. Do you have any solutions on this type of harassment, either bail reform or this, that the committee could consider?
So on that, I have made reports to the police, and when I have, on some occasions, I've been asked what I would like the police to do. On other occasions, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I was told it didn't rise to the level. So I do feel that there's a disconnect between what we received. I do want to make a comment, though, on serial harassers, that and I know the members from Alberta, I'm from Ontario. I will talk about Ontario. It's provincially appointed judges who are making bail decisions. Ontario jails are overrun, and judges are hesitant to send people to provincially, not federally run facilities. It's a complicated issue. We did bring forward a bill which was supported by all parties on bail reform, but I do think we should focus on what we can do as individuals on MP to MP harassment, and not, there are broader conversations to be had about the criminal justice system in general.
Thanks very much, Ms. Rempel-Garner and Ms. Damoff. Colleagues, I am going to be a little bit more generous and flexible just in terms of allowing the questions to be asked and the answers to those questions to be given in order to ensure that we're respecting the sensitivity of the conversation. This will go on both sides, of course, of the table. But we're going to try to stay tight to our time as best as possible. With that, Ms. Romanato, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank my colleagues for being here today and for sharing what they've been going through. That I think pretty much every female member of Parliament has been subject to. I have 2 questions, so I just want to premise this with, I'm sure you're aware that currently the members of the House of Commons Workplace Harassment and Violence Prevention Policy does not apply for harassment between member to member. It is a loophole. So right now, a member of Parliament who is being harassed by another member of Parliament has no venue or no recourse, and we're trying to close that. I want to talk a little bit, and I'd like to hear your feedback. Ms. Damoff, you mentioned that when you go out, you're concerned for your physical safety. Have you taken steps when you're out at an event for your own safety? Could you describe, if you have, and what those would be?
Thank you for the question. And through you, Chair, yes, I have, and I appreciate all that the House of Commons has done in terms of offering, you know, the panic buttons, doing security assessments. Certainly, the way my community office operates now is very different than it was when I was elected in 2015. The last 2 events that I hosted for Canada Day and a family skate, we as MPs have the ability to have a security assessment done. In both cases, they determined that I should have security there. I believe the rules have changed now, but at the time I had to pay for that out of my office budget. And we didn't have any incidents. It was reassuring, though, to know that that there was security that was present at those events.
And you both mentioned, and we all have the same, we have our email accounts, we have our online accounts, our Facebook pages, and so on. And often it is parliamentary staff who are receiving those phone calls, receiving those emails, having to respond to them, seeing those posts in the comments. What has that impact had on your staff?
Thank you for the question. It has a significant impact, right? I mean, yes, there are ways in which staff can rely on mental health services provided by the House of Commons, but how often do they take it? For my own office, I give 10 days, no questions asked, mental health days to my staff. Whenever they need to take it, they should. And that is an honor system that we have amongst ourselves. But I've seen some of the things that they have had to deal with. My own social media, I don't check it, I don't monitor it because it's a lot. But my staff do. And it is not fair to them. It is not fair to them to have to be subjected to all of that. I think that we need to do better by our staff, whether it's in our constituency offices or on the Hill, to ensure that their mental health is safe and that we are retaining proper talent, that they're not leaving because they've become so disengaged with the world of politics and how nasty it can get.
So MP Khalid, you mentioned something that it's the first time I'm hearing that, politics of agitation. And so what we heard on Tuesday was that we've seen a lot of hate on social media. A lot of social media sites are not allowing us to report, or when we report it, it's not, when I say report to the platforms themselves, it's not taken seriously. The Sergeant at Arms has said that, you know, X or Twitter won't even take their calls anymore. I myself have, after sitting in PROC, received a death threat on my social media because of a comment that was made in committee. So given the fact that our online presence is paid for by taxpayers, with respect to whether we're boosting posts and things like that, or having social media accounts, it was suggested that perhaps members of Parliament should also have an online code of conduct in terms of, as you said, politics of agitation, whereas the member of Parliament may not necessarily be personally attacking you, but the content that they're putting is put on there with the intent to crank, to get that machine going, the Twitter army. What would your recommendations be on how do we tackle this?
It's a very good question, and you know what? I went through this myself last week, where a member of the Ethics Committee, Mr. PROC, tweeted out against me, like just very, very strange tweet, which resulted in agitation, and it was deliberate, it was malicious, and you know, I like to say that common sense perhaps is not that common, right? We are expected to be held to a higher standard between ourselves and how we conduct ourselves as members of Parliament, who we represent, how we represent them. And so if we need to start legislating our own conduct, how can we expect Canadians to do better? So yes, perhaps legislation is in order now. Perhaps a code of conduct needs to be included in members of Parliament's code of conduct going forward, because this is not right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Madame Gaudreau, je passe la parole à vous pour...
Ms. Goudreau, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. What courage. Dear colleague, what courage. If I may, before I get to the few questions I have, just to explain, and again, it's not the first time I'm saying this, but to what extent I am ashamed. I'm ashamed of us. I belong to this. I have the sense that what is taking place, and some don't want to hear, they're not listening to the interpretation, but I hope that it does trickle down. Right now, we're really taking a deep look at ourselves, because there's so many elements that we could point to. And what outrages me so much, and that is the right word, is that even though the majority of people will say, of course, this is intolerable, this is unacceptable, but inside, and as part of our very institution, how is it that this is taking place today? How is it possible that we accept to tolerate that? And let me explain. So this looking inside means what? What is missing? Is it on behalf of achieving gain, power, and its partisanship, which is able to take a great deal? But what is respect? And today we're speaking about harassment. Harassment, and there I've heard words, and again, I'm thinking about interpreters who had to translate these words into French, are completely unacceptable. It's urgent to act, and I think that all of the institution will be in complete agreement. This said, however, I'm still hearing comments saying to us, who is poisoning and contributing to the collateral damage of what can be done when we have permission to speak and to be respected? So, to our witnesses, I'd like to ask this question. Saying words is one thing. They have an impact on social networks, but to be threatened, to receive death threats, it's unacceptable. But when we're speaking about harassment, can a kind of behavior, such as not being listened to, often that occurs, that is, we roll our eyes, and we smile, because we disrespectfully or we move away, not to incite the person who's often a woman. So am I the only one who experiences that, or is that something that you also commonly experience? These aren't necessarily words, and I'd like to hear you speak to that.
Thank you very much for that. And it's been an honor to serve with you and to travel with you and know and appreciate that when the cameras are off, we have good relationships with one another. I remember I bought Michael Barrett a piece of cake for his birthday. I remember Melissa Lantzman brought me a fillet of fish one day when I was very hungry and it was pretty late at night. We are capable of having good, strong relationships with each other because when the cameras are off, they exist. Those relationships absolutely exist. When the cameras are off, we are able to get through committee work and get out consensus reports and work on the important issues. So I think maybe the problem is the camera or the fact that that we have the ability to spread so much so fast using social media. And I think those are questions that this committee should be asking experts as you continue with this study.
If I could just add, I think the algorithms on social media, that push the angry social media to the top, and the positive or even just policy-related social media posts don't get the same kind of engagement. I think that plays into what we as politicians post, and so the angry, aggressive type of things that get posted, that in turn drive the public to contact MPs, does play a big role in it. So I see a huge difference in the kind of engagement that I get versus a Facebook Live from an MP calling Liberals corrupt, which gets shared 500,000 times. I don't get anywhere near that when I post about a Young Women in Leadership program or something like being really proud to have supported Len Weber's private member's bill on organ donation. That kind of goes nowhere, whereas the angry, aggressive social media goes straight to the top because of the algorithms.
Madame Gaudreau, il reste seulement quelques secondes.
En terminant,
Ms. Gaudreau, you have a few seconds left. Mr. Chair, I have 2 minutes 30. But as we look inside, I'd like to say that when there's consensus among the parties and that we accept unacceptable behavior, I hear connivance there, and I hope that you have understood what I'm trying to express. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Gaudreau.
The floor is yours for 6 minutes.
I'm often amazed by colleagues in this place, for good or for bad. Today, you have shown incredible strength, and I am grateful for that. This is actually one of the reasons why I was so adamant about having this study, and so grateful that we could get to it. You did mention, and I want to pick up on MP Demoff, you had talked about that social media piece, those algorithms. Oftentimes, it's seen as the individual's responsibility to police on social media, and yet there is a role, of course, for what we're seeing in terms of the social giants and their responsibility, the money that they make. The Sergeant of Arms actually, even in the last committee meeting, stated that when they were trying to address specific issues with Twitter, they had at one point had connections. They no longer have those. What can we do as part of that, as legislators, to address that better? Do you think, I think building off of what Ms. Romanato had said in terms of a code of conduct online, are there things that maybe we need to do in terms of our internal security systems that have to do with monitoring that or policing that a bit.
I do think a code of conduct would be helpful. I don't know that there would be consequences. I know when I heard at the last meeting the description of harassment as it applies elsewhere, and cyberbullying was one of them. But I also think we as individuals need to think twice before we're posting something that we know is going to incite an organization like the gun lobby. When you deliberately post something that stirs up that kind of anger in public. And I will say that being on the ethics committee has been an eye-opener for me in terms of the number of times that I've been called corrupt and a criminal, and it's actually quite shocking. So, it goes beyond just what the policies are, but individual attacks which stir up the public. The social media companies do bear responsibility on this. Even when we could report, I can remember reporting tweets that were horrific and getting a message back saying it didn't contravene our community standards. So, there is some responsibility there with social media companies, not just for MPs, but for every Canadian that gets subjected to abuse online.
The piece, of course, though, and that's what we're trying to also deal with here, understanding our role within this. A lot of my colleagues have said that when they've tried to report these incidences, or they have, and I would like to know about your examples that you gave, what your experience was, that there were clear links to far-right extreme organizations pumping it up, the Rebel News media outlets, the Proud Boys as examples, and the links that police found if they were investigated. Did you find that in both of your experiences?
So I've had right-wing extremist members stalk my office, hang out in front of
Rappel
my
au règlement,
office.
Monsieur le Président. J'ai
Sorry,
beaucoup
Ms.
souci
Keller,
de nos
just one
A point of order. I was listening to the interpreters, and apparently two microphones are open at the same time, so perhaps they aren't able to hear the comments made. Just a moment. We're going to try and see what is taking place.
Okay, Madame Gaudreau, on va.
Ms. Gaudreau, we're going to resume. If there's an issue, please let us know in a few seconds, and then we're going to continue with Ms. Khaled. Go ahead, Ms. Khaled.
Saying I've had members of right-wing extremist organizations that have stalked my office, that have shared my home address amongst each other, laughed, obviously, called me a lot of names verbally, videotaped me while I'm walking around in my community, etc. There's definitely a link. And when I talk about the politics of agitation, that's exactly it. I gave the example of when I had tabled Motion 103, where the Conservative Party leadership used my motion to raise funds for themselves by spreading deliberate misinformation. It was specifically that they leveraged a lot of these organizations to come and raise the alarm and raise the agitation amongst Canadians to pit Canadian against Canadian. So there's definitely a role here and a link between members of Parliament and how the information is spread and used for own political gains.
Ms. Matheson, there's just a couple of seconds left in your round here.
I'll bank it then.
Okay, sounds good. Ms. Rempel-Garner, it's over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to be clear with my two colleagues here. You aren't suggesting that the Liberal Party hasn't made statements that have agitated people in the past, right? You admit that's happened.
I think every MP needs to look at what they've done, Michelle. So I'm not going to say the Liberal Party, but I will say that there have been instances when individuals in my party have done things.
So I asked this to prove a point, because where we can't get to a point is, like, if you two aren't willing to say that the Liberals have not engaged in this behavior, I have been on the receiving end of what you have described, but what your members have done. So what we can't get into when we're talking about solutions is pretending that one party is above scrutiny, right? And so to avoid that, I would suggest that the solutions need to be oriented towards using what is in law for criminal harassment, hate speech, and where there are gaps in that prevent not just us, any Canadian, from accessing justice or de-escalating these types of behavior, that we go there. Would you agree with that principle, that any forward solution on this can't be governed by a partisan body?
I absolutely agree.
Okay.
And in my remarks, I even said that it's not all Conservative. And I can only, and my colleague can only speak to what we've experienced, Ms. Rempel-Garneau. We can't speak to what you or Ms. Ferreri or anyone else has experienced. I can only speak about what's happened to me and the impact that has been a direct result of a Conservative MP. I can't speak to anything that anyone else has
But you wouldn't
experienced.
suggest that the Prime Minister is directly responsible for the harassment I've received, would you?
I've been trying to stay above the fray because I'm not getting into whether the opposition leader or the Prime Minister. I mean, if you want to go there, we can. But I really would prefer not to.
Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is that solutions have to be objective and not be governed by, and I have concerns that a code of conduct that would be governed by a partisan body or a quasi-partisan body wouldn't get to that point. So, for recommendations, would you support a recommendation, particularly going into the next federal election, where intimate images that are created by deepfake technology, that those types of images would be applied to the same criminal code sanctions that are in the criminal code right now for sort of traditional intimate images?
I'm not a lawyer, so I'll just give my own personal opinion. I know you've done a lot of work, a lot more than I have, on AI and that type of thing, but absolutely.
Okay. The other thing I was thinking of was that there needs to be a mechanism by which, when there's repeated harassing behavior that has gotten to a point where, a court of justice sees or there's a summary conviction, that there's a clear instance of repeated harassment, that law enforcement should be able to go under some sort of an order and obtain the identity of somebody from a social media platform so that charges could be laid. Right now there's gray area in the law. Would you recommend something like that?
So when we, the Ethics Committee actually went to the RCMP last week and got a whole training session on their digital forensic, and that's an issue that they raised with us.
Okay, so we need some legislation on that. The other thing is, when there's clear instances of repeated harassing behavior online, and we're not talking about like a single mean tweet or something here, but like there's somebody who's clearly repeatedly harassing somebody, threatening, obscene, whatever the definition is, that there needs to be some sort of intervention available to the Court of Justice so that that person is directed to stop communicating with somebody. That doesn't exist right now. Would you recommend that that's something that the government should be looking into at this point in time?
Yes, and actually Julie Lalonde is a witness in the next panel. I think she'd be a good person to ask those questions to. She has a lot of experience on that.
Thank you. And again, like, the reason why I'm looking at objective solutions is that, I could sit here and talk about members of the Liberal Party that I've had to block on social media, but because they have sent hordes after me, right? I just think that if we get into a situation where we are censoring speech, particularly where we are saying the government's position is the positive position that needs to be uploaded, and that criticism of the government is downloaded in a legitimate situation, that we're doing democracy a disservice. Not saying there isn't a problem with what you and me and others have received. I'm just trying to look at objective solutions. So would you recommend in that scenario that we look at strengthening or closing loopholes that are in existing criminal justice laws that prevent law enforcement from intervening at early stages that allow this behavior to escalate into, hate speech, threats of violence, or actual violence?
Colleagues, just I've let that question go about 60 seconds over, so a quick response. I'm sorry to rush.
Yes.
Well, Ms. Damoff, that was exemplary in terms of quick. Thank you very much. Thanks, Ms. Rempel-Garner. Mr. Erskine-Smith, we turn the floor over to you for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. And Ikra Pam, thanks for your testimony. The comments that you read out are, absolutely shameful. And I guess where it might be more constructive to spend time is when it comes to member versus member harassment. And we obviously have a code for sexual harassment, and there's no place for that, and that's rightly in place. We, at the same time, though, have rules in the chamber related to privilege where we wouldn't have a defamation action that could be brought, for example, because of comments that are spoken in the House of Commons. And we privilege free speech of members in representing their constituents to a very high degree. And how do you see balancing that idea of privilege and the ability to voice concerns, and in some cases voice them in such a problematic way that it might rise to defamation in the House, but it's not actionable? How do you see squaring that with members' code of conduct vis-a-vis members around harassment?
I'll start. Thank you for that question. Really appreciate it. As I had said in my opening remarks, members should not be allowed to do indirectly what they cannot do directly. And the code of conduct for members of parliament is very, very clear about how we should be conducting ourselves, what we should be allowed to say in the House or not. And we have the wherewithal, we have the freedom to be able to represent our constituents and to raise the voices that our constituents need us to raise. But at the same time, I think strengthening or perhaps really clarifying that rule that you cannot do indirectly what you can't do directly would be a good starting point. And as members have suggested as well, to create a clear code of conduct online as well, and members' social media. Look, the thing is that we are and should be held to a higher standard. And we need to make sure that our actions are parliamentary. And I think there's always that gut check, right? When you know what you've done is not parliamentary. I know that I have, and I admit to it, deleted tweets that I have found afterwards I wasn't too comfortable with. So I think, one, we need to check ourselves. Two, if we can't check ourselves, we need to clarify the rules of code of conduct for members of parliament.
Pam, do you have anything else you want to add?
That's fine, Nate. Through you, Chair, sorry.
About 2 minutes left, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
Thanks. Do you worry at all about, this place is a circus at the best of times, and it can be even more of a circus when things go on too long, where we haven't had constituency weeks and we enter June and all that. Do you worry at all? You look at what's happening to the Speaker right now, and there are certain rules that then people stand on those rules and they turn those rules into an even greater circus. Do you worry at all that if there's a harassment policy in place that, that in turn becomes just another procedural tool in some ways for a member to go at another member and to say, you said this, and I'm going to say it's harassment and turn it into a circus in its own right?
Good question. Perhaps. I will say there's 338 of us in this house. We are so privileged to be here. And the examples that we set the tone for every single Canadian. And when Canadians, and I worry about young people in particular, look at what's going on right now, I worry that they look at all of it and throw up their hands and say, well, one is as bad as the other. I don't want anything to do with it. Whether or not a code of conduct could be weaponized, I think we need to look at how we can do it. The same could be said for sexual harassment between members, and we managed to do something on that. So I do think there's a way that that it can be done in a way that is not going to be weaponized.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks. Honestly, to have gone through every member of parliament deals with different elements of it, but I have never even come close to experiencing anything remotely what you two have gone through, and it's outrageous that anyone would have to listen to and read and experience the things you guys have experienced. So thanks for being here.
Thanks very much, Mr. Erskine-Smith. Colleagues, just before we move on to the final couple of interventions, I do note that we are running a little bit behind schedule. So I would just encourage members to be in touch with their staff or their respective whips offices in the event that they need to be somewhere else. We're probably going to end up, because we have a third panel, going 15 or 20 minutes over time today. So I just wanted to intervene very quickly to give you the courtesy of having some time to address that. Madame Gaudreau, il y a 2 minutes 30 secondes qui restent pour vous. Alors, je passe la...
Ms. Gaudreau, you have 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. From the outset, I'll be brief, but I will take the time to say this slowly. I dare to hope that what we have just seen here, with all of the courage and the honesty and the frankness that we saw, that today, a week from now rather, there won't be partisan mobilization, which might be the outcome of this and could be used as a harmful means, because I've understood that it is even more serious than what I had thought. And I hope that those of you who bear the flag will wear it. We're not going to change something small today only. So I know that earlier I might have not well formulated my question, but essentially it was to understand how far harassment goes in our actions, in our attitude. And the conclusion I draw from this today, that is, there's urgency. It's a serious situation. So when I've heard about the possibility of striking a subcommittee, that will be impartial, because we're going to achieve some progress in maintaining that that's not partisan. And if somebody says, sure, we're not looking for power, we can make sure that, yes, there will be neutrality so that we can set the example. And I don't think that it's a 180 turn, but we need a 360-degree turn. In closing, I have one remaining question to Ms. Demoff. Could we imagine one day that a man who has been subjected to harassment would have done what you have dared to do? That is because it's not possible to tolerate, and who would have resigned, as you did on May 1st?
You actually give me the opportunity to talk about a double standard that I've seen when I brought this up at Ethics Committee. I was called a pearl clutcher and labeled as being hysterical, and that it was the price to pay for being a federally elected official. And then earlier this month, a former Conservative MP testified and talked about the way that he got harassed online, and he was called a hero by his conservative colleagues. And I will say it's disheartening that women who speak out, and I'm sure my friend and colleague here has had the same experience, are called pearl clutchers, and men who, Sean Fraser has told me he doesn't experience anything near to what I've experienced online since I first got elected. So there is a difference in the way that women and men are treated, and I think how they respond to the type of comments and abuse that we get.
Thank you.
Je vous remercie beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, du temps que vous m'avez accordé.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to thank you for the additional time you have given me. Thank you.
Half and change. Over to you.
Thank you. There is absolutely a double standard, and it is interesting. I'm often told, you have to have a thick skin, to work up in Parliament, but you signed up for it, and I'm sure that we all agree that you did not sign up for this. I wanted to quickly get to, you talked a lot about the impacts of your staff. I know that we rely upon them so much, and they are so integral to all the work that we do, and they are incredible. I worry about mine, and I worry about the supports that we have in place through administration. So have you put your minds to any additional supports that you would like to see for your staff who have to deal with a lot of this as well?
Thanks for that question. I don't think our staff get enough credit for the work that they do. None of us in this room could do the work we do without the staff that support us. I sent my speech to a former staffer to read over last night, and when she responded, she said, the individual said, "Thank you for saying all of this. It made my heart jump a bit with anxiety as I feel it again, even though I left some time ago." It was traumatizing, and it is traumatizing for staff, especially with repeated phone calls into the community office. I'm sure you get that in London as well. And as Ms. Khalid was saying, reading through the emails, and I don't think there's enough support for them. I think the House of Commons does as much as has done a lot, and I know they're aware of the issue. They've done de-escalation training for staff so that they hopefully have the tools to be able to de-escalate these calls. But it's pretty intimidating. Most of our staff are young people, and it's pretty intimidating, especially for the ones on the front line in the community, to be faced with this at the door of your office or on the phone, because a lot of times these people who call, they call repeatedly. They hide their phone numbers so that you don't know who's calling. I've explicitly said not to answer phone calls from outside our area code because a lot of times those calls are abusive, and quite frankly, if someone lives in a different area code, they're not my constituent likely. So, and if they are, they can leave a message. But I think our staff are really underlooked in what happens in our offices.
Can I just very quickly add to that? Everything that Pam said, Ms. Demoff said, is accurate. I would make a very quick plug. Our staff don't get paid enough to deal with the things that they deal with. If you guys can help us in paying our staff better wages, I think we'd be able to help support them a lot better as well.
Thank you very much to everybody. Ms. Ferreri, the floor will be yours for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Excuse me. Pardon my voice. Thank you for having me here today. Excuse me. And thank you to our two witnesses. It is certainly a story to be a person in politics and then add the woman in front of it. It is different. And, I appreciate the testimony. I've always joked. I said, imagine we started a mean tweets, like Jimmy Kimmel used to do, and we all, as MPs from every party, just read them. One of the things that it popped up, and my colleague really eloquently positioned this, and it's that legitimate criticism versus harassment. And I think there's a lot around that, because it is our job, as she has mentioned, in opposition, to ensure that we are we're holding that line, and people don't feel heard. And I guess one of the questions I would ask you is, a lot of those messages you read in particular, Pam, they were they were pretty graphic. They were from the public. They weren't from other members. But do you think those people that write those things are doing okay?
So they were sent to me, though, through you, Chair. They were sent to me as a result of the action of another member of Parliament. So it wasn't anything I had done. It wasn't necessarily policy related. But in answer to your question, though, I do think since the pandemic, I have found it's gotten much worse since the pandemic, and I do think that a lot of people are struggling with mental health and are struggling dealing with threats, whether it's to their health, to their safety, whether to what's going on around the world. So I do think that there are a lot of people, and I also want to say, too, that the vast majority of Canadians are good and decent people who do not treat other people in this way, but it's becoming more and more prevalent in society.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I think what people say online versus what they say to your face are very different. They're very, very different things. Just to retract then, so you're saying that those messages that you read into the record today, they were directly linked to an MP's comments? Or they were just random messages to you?
They came to, so look, I have had over my almost 9 years as an MP, thousands of just horrific messages. The examples I gave, though, most of them were the result of the actions of an MP posting something, which then resulted in a flood directly related to what that individual had posted.
Okay, thank you. I think sometimes, too, it is important to say policies. Like, I think sometimes there's policies that make people feel unheard or unseen, and I'm not excusing it. Listen, I'm on the same end. I have, criminal charges against people who've threatened to kill myself as well. But I think sometimes it's, to your point, if people don't feel heard, right? I think that is a piece of the puzzle, and Ms. Rempel-Garner touched on this greatly. And I would suggest that recommendation. The biggest thing I get told is nobody answers a question in question period, and people, and you have the worst food insecurity in history. You have you have a mental health crisis. You have suicide rates. You have all of these things, and I don't justify people's hateful behavior, but there's always a reason why somebody is doing what they're doing, and so I think, on a bigger scale, when we look at raising our children and knowing, you can't say that to somebody's face, so don't say it online, And so I think when we're making these recommendations, I think it is great to go back to sort of the criminal piece of it. One of the things that's come up a lot in my work is the Victims' Bill of Rights. A lot of people feel that criminals have more rights in this country than victims. And in 2020, there was an ask by the Office of the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime, asked for a parliamentary review of the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights, citing top 4 issues that needed to be addressed. And it's never been addressed. It's never happened. And so I guess my question to you is twofold. Where do you see that? Should that be re-examined? Would you suggest something like that as well?
Can I share with you? So a couple of months ago, MP Michael Barrett had started a Facebook Live in which he had called my colleague and I corrupt, released our emails, etc., which led to a whole bunch of hate coming towards me, people calling, people emailing, on social media, etc. But there was this one lady, Peggy. She drove 2 hours to my constituency office, and she was very, very upset, asking me why I was a corrupt individual. Why am I shutting down committees? Why am I not allowing investigations to happen? Why do I think it's okay for us to XYZ? I sat down with her. We had a conversation for about half an hour. And she gave me the biggest hug when she left. And I think to me that really proves a point When I talk about the politics of agitation, it is that spreading or framing an issue in a way that really does agitate people, that makes them anxious. It adds an extra layer to whatever that they're dealing with on a daily basis as it is. So I think that we as members of parliament have a responsibility to be more fair in how we engage in social media.
Sorry, so just to clarify, do you think the Victims' Bill of Rights needs to be amended?
So on that, I've got a meeting with the ombudsperson for the victims of crime. I've met with the office in the past. They reminded me that most people who are in jail are also victims of abuse. So, you know, I think any of our policies, whether it's the Victims' Bill of Rights or several other things that we deal with, it's always a good thing to take a look at them. But I think we need to bear in mind, you know, and if you've met with that individual, the ombudsperson, you'll know that they have a very balanced approach to victims.
Thanks very much, Ms. Namoff. Okay, the last intervention for this panel will be you, Ms. Romanato, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So I wanted to go back to something you said, MP Damoff, with respect to we already have a system in place with respect to the code of conduct for members dealing with sexual harassment. And in that code of conduct, there's a mechanism, and it is not political parties that are involved. This is literally, there are professionals with Human Resources Office that deals with complaints and mediation and so on and so forth. So we know a model already exists. So as it was indicated in Appendix A of the workplace harassment policy that unfortunately doesn't apply between MPs, it gives examples of behaviors that can be considered harassment. Would you say that it would be pretty easy for us to implement the harassment policy between MPs because we already have a model in which complaints can be brought forward, but also an example of lists of behaviors that would not be acceptable, but also I think would be helpful, and I'd like your opinion on this, mediation or reconciliation. And when I say that, for instance, if there is a member who is being targeted online by another member, which then indirectly gets the harassment going, if there was a mechanism where you could invite that member of parliament to a meeting with a professional, with a human resources, with a mediation officer to say, look, I'm not sure if you realize that what you're doing is causing a lot of hurt. It's creating this mass of hate and so on. Because there is no mechanism and we have a very adversarial job that we already do, would you recommend that maybe we have systems in place so that we can actually bring our colleagues together and say, look, this behavior is not acceptable and I need you to help stop it? What would you recommend? I'm trying to talk about not the indirect hate, but how can we prevent getting there?
I think the mechanism you've described would be helpful. I hate to say anything is easy to do, but yes, I do. I do think that would be helpful.
Okay, and with respect to the impact on families, my family looks at my page, right, and I try to put a lot of positive things out. I don't do the personal attacks. I just really put out a lot of positive stuff. But when I get the comments, I know my dad would call and say, Sherry, like, do they even know you? Like, you're such a nice person. Why are people saying that about you? It's very hurtful for our families to see that. And I have people come up to me saying, I've seen some of the stuff people, like, do they even know you? You're a nice person, right? I don't think people realize when that's happening, our families are affected as well. So then when you're having that conversation on whether you're going to run again or whether you're going to continue doing what you're doing, a lot of time the family is saying, look, do you really want to keep putting up with that? And it impacts our ability to do what we do. I know I self-regulate in the chamber now. There are times I want to get up and ask a question. I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to. You know why? Because it's just going to invite the hate. So my privilege is actually being taken away because I self-regulate. I decide what parts of the debate I'm going to participate in because I just don't want to invite it. Would you say that's something that's happening as well?
I am sorry. I'm pretty sure my son is watching right now. He's 34 years old. He's not a little kid. And I know that what happens to me here bothers him a lot more than it bothers me. And it has an impact on him and his family. I worry about our family's safety. You know, I don't have young kids living at home anymore. But I do worry about MPs who have young kids who are subjected to abuse. But it does. In 2018, my son called out someone who had attacked me online, and the Oakville Beaver, actually, our local newspaper, which doesn't really exist anymore, but did a story about it, about the bullying of MPs in politics. But I do know that it has a huge impact on our families, and that's across party lines. But it also, I think, weighs into what we do and don't do. I actually sent him my speech last night, and then I said, don't read it, because I figured it would be better if he only heard it once and didn't read it ahead of time. But I think it's harder on our families than it is for us as individuals, and I think that you're correct that it does impact what we do and don't do in the House, in anticipation of what might happen out in the real world.
Thank you very much, Ms. Danoff. Colleagues, this brings us to the end of the second panel. I do just want to take a moment, and as I look around the table and online, and I want to thank Ms. Rempel-Garner, Ferrari, Matheson, Khalid, Demov, Romanado, and Gaudreau in particular, because I do appreciate that life in politics, as difficult as it is certainly more difficult for women. I think we've heard that exemplified here today in some brave and courageous testimony. I can't imagine it was easy to share on all sides of the aisle. And I know that many of us men who are subject, sure, to certain things are never diminished as a result of our gender. And that is something that is very specific to our female colleagues. And I do...
Just on a point of order for that, I'd just like for the record to say that I don't feel like my experience has been diminished by my gender. So I just want to put that on the record. Thanks.
Fair enough, yeah. And sorry, Mr. Rempel-Garner, I meant to say that
Thanks.
On our behalf. Colleagues, we're going to suspend briefly, and we are then going to go into our final panel. Thank you. Acknowledge that we have gone over, and I did my best to be fair to all sides in relation to the amount of speaking time that they got. Having said that, I appreciate that it can be challenging to our respective schedules when we go further than we intend. So what I propose, and I'm looking around the room to make sure that there is some agreement to this, is that we get a full round in of questioning, and then we evaluate where we're at the end of that round in terms of what members' responsibilities may be. It's always possible, of course, for myself to stick around and for some other members to stick around as well and acknowledge that there won't be voting on certain procedures or anything, but that we have an informal part of the meeting that can continue with witnesses. I think we can discuss that when we get there, but I do want to try to be respectful to everybody's schedule. So let's get going, and then folks are welcome to come and talk to me at the outset here and see where they want to go. With that, I would like to welcome the witnesses on our next panel. And apologies, colleagues, I have to find my notes. So I would like to welcome Julie Lalonde, a public educator, to the committee today. And I don't have the other name here. And Sabrina Delhan, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Samaras Center for Democracy. Sorry, colleagues, the notes were printed before there were changes to the list. Ms. Lalonde, I'm going to go to you first for 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then Ms. Delhan 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then we're going to get into our line of questioning. So the floor is over to you, Ms. Lalonde.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm delighted that Samara was added to the list because their work is actually something I was going to reference because they do incredibly important work. So thank you for the invitation. Je m'appelle Julie S. Lalonde et je vous remercie.
Thank you. My name is Julie Lalonde. I've been working for more than 20 years to put an end to gender-based violence in Canada. I worked directly with victims and survivors as a counselor in sexual assault centres. I've drafted several policies and procedures for various organizations, and I also have trained thousands and thousands of Canadians, and I do this every year, on how they should intervene to create safer communities. I've never been a staffer or worked in politics, but I have trained MPs, MPPs, staffers, and interns from across all parties at the provincial and federal levels.
Concerns that I've received and heard from staff and interns over the years of doing those trainings. So the primary concern is around defining the actual issues at hand. And I observed Tuesday's meeting, and I was here this morning, and I see that that is a continuous conversation happening here. So if I said to you, the solution to harassment is orange, we can all nod our heads and be like, great, that sounds like an awesome plan. We leave here, ready to tackle the problem. But the issue is that half of you were thinking of the fruit and the other half were thinking of the color, but all of you were convinced that you were heading in the right direction and the same direction. So in reading the policy and the code of conduct and in listening to the previous committee meetings, as I said, there seems to remain much confusion about what exactly constitutes harassment and what to do if it happens to you or someone that you work with. And this brings me to the second common concern I hear from primarily staffers and interns is, okay, now what? There remains much confusion as to who exactly to report harassment to, what confidentiality looks like in that process, what accountability looks like in that process, etc. Knowledge is power, and we cannot expect people to come forward as targets of harassment or as bystanders. And I will emphasize that several times over, the importance of bystanders in this conversation. We cannot expect them to come forward if they're in the dark on what happens next. The House of Commons needs what is referred to as a no wrong door policy, which encourages people to disclose to anyone they trust to figure out how to handle feelings of unsafety or concern. Finally, I've heard much frustration from members and staffers and interns that there remains a failure to recognize 21st century realities. And this has been named quite a few times. So what happens online does matter. If you were to bank somewhere where you could not do online banking, you would be furious. So to pretend that what happens on the internet is not real is naive in 2024. Coordinated mob attacks, whether they are via bots or individuals, do impact one's ability to do their job. Those on the front lines of managing social media, as was referenced earlier today, those who are answering the emails, answering the phone calls, who are behind your Twitter accounts, behind your Facebook accounts, those folks need to be protected and they need to be supported in their difficult roles. The work members and their staffers do is also incredibly mobile and often changes day to day, and so there needs to be an understanding written into policies and procedures that all harassment is unacceptable, whether it happened in the house, at the office, or at a community meet and greet barbecue. We are living in increasingly volatile times, and that needs to be reflected in your policies and your work here. Finally, I'm happy to speak on best practices for violence prevention and culture change. That is my area of expertise. But most importantly, I want to convey the urgency in getting this conversation right. We all have the right to a safe and equitable workplace, but members of Parliament are also setting an example for Canadians. Getting it right here sends a message that civility matters, that we can disagree with each other without veering into personal attack, and that conflicts can be resolved in a way where everyone is able to move forward. Creating a safer House of Commons means creating a more democratic House of Commons, and that benefits all of us. Merci.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lalonde. Ms. Dillon, we'll go to you for up to 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to speak with the committee today. My name is Sabrina Dellin, and I'm the CEO of the Samara Centre for Democracy, which is a nonpartisan charity dedicated to making Canada's democratic culture more accessible, responsive, and inclusive. We have been studying the lived experience of elected officials for over 15 years through our MP Exit Interview project, which has produced several publications and 2 podcasts. This material serves as a key resource for aspiring politicians, is used by high school and post-secondary educators across the country to teach about active citizenship, and it's received extensive media attention. Over 160 exit interviews have been conducted with former members of Parliament since 2008, and today I'll be drawing on our most recent cohort of interviews to guide potential changes to the workplace harassment and violence prevention policy. In these interviews, former MPs across parties have expressed concerns that their conditions of work create significant barriers to achieving a parliament that is representative of Canadian society. They call for modernization in the form of more flexibility, stronger HR policies, and formalized protocols to prevent harassment. Our interviewees feel that these changes are crucial in order to attract and retain parliamentarians. This was a defining theme in this group, more so than in previous cohorts. MPs repeatedly shared concerns that a failure to improve Parliament as a workplace would undermine the faith and trust that Canadians have in this institution. The way forward isn't through policies alone, but through the formation of a healthy culture that can reverse this normalization of an increasingly hostile environment on and offline. This requires considering the following questions. What are the rewards for good behavior? How are parties incentivized to contribute to civility and collegiality? And what other healthy boundaries can be put into place to foster a more productive condition of work? I'll turn now to specific feedback about the working conditions from former MPs. Encountering racialized comments were identified by interviewees as a significant risk when serving in the House of Commons. This problem was compounded by the absence of mechanisms to address these instances, which brought forth a sense of alienation. In terms of gender equity, harassment of younger women MPs was brought up as a point of concern amongst a number of our interviewees, both men and women. And some interviewees spoke of the negative effects of harassment or bullying during question period, which they connected to the broader harassment and silencing of women and underrepresented groups in the political arena. The effect of online harassment of MPs was also a recurring theme. Our interviewees explained how harassment affected their mental health and extended to their families. This is a particular concern from those that are from minoritized communities who receive a high volume of online abuse. Recently, we've seen numerous politicians at all orders of government leave the political arena because of hate and harassment that came to define their job. This isn't just about having a thick skin or being more resilient. In our interviews, the women we spoke with frequently mentioned receiving death threats and struggling to get the appropriate security that they required. If safer working conditions aren't put into place, then the leaders that we need, the leaders that reflect Canada's diverse communities, won't stay, or they'll stop stepping forward altogether. The context I've outlined here takes a significant toll on staff and has a chilling effect on public engagement. People are pushed away from democratic engagement instead of being drawn in. None of our interviewees regret devoting years to public service, and they share their stories with us to help evolve life in Parliament. In this period of global democratic backsliding, it's never been more urgent to secure healthy conditions of civic engagement. We're willing to partner to support a safer and more inclusive workplace should the committee see a role for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dellin. We appreciate the opening statement. Ms. Rempel-Garner, I'll speak slowly. The first round of questioning will go to you for 6 minutes. Okay.
My apologies for the cornbread. It's really good, by the way. I encourage all of you to avail yourself of lunch on Sparks Street today. But on to serious matters. I think what we should be trying to do here is drive to recommendations that affect change. One of the frustrations that I've had over the course of my hot minute career is the weekly request for an interview on how do you feel about being a woman in politics and blah, blah, blah. And I have yet to have an interview to respond to substantive changes that would improve some of these issues. So I'd like to go to recommendations. The CBC reported about 2 weeks ago that the RCMP was recommending stronger measures to protect members of Parliament from online harassment and abuse. And my reaction was, if you can't protect me, how can you protect other Canadian women? And we know that online harassment is a behavior that escalates into physical violence. It creates anxiety, lack of productivity, numerous other impacts in the family. So I'd like to focus recommendations on ways to prevent that writ large. There's 3 recommendations I'd like the committee to consider. First, that the loophole under the gray area under Canada's current intimate image distribution laws that does not explicitly include deepfakes, that be closed and that language be put in the criminal code, particularly ahead of the next federal election. Would you both agree with that recommendation?
Absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that.
From Samara. Okay. The next thing I'd like to see is that there's a gap. There's 2 gaps. First of all, oftentimes this type of harassment comes from anonymous sources. And I'm not talking about like a singular, a mean tweet objecting to a policy position or even calling me a name. It is repetitive harassment from the same person. Oftentimes, as was mentioned by one of the previous witnesses, and not just for MPs, but like for all women, there will be a time where the law enforcement will go, well, I'm not sure what we can do about that. To the point that Ms. Lalonde made, it's very difficult to even know where to call when you are being harassed by somebody online. So I would like to recommend, or I would just like to get your position on recommending that in instances of clear, repeated harassment, defining it along the lines of what constitutes criminal harassment, but that a judge could issue an order to social media companies to provide the identity of a person so that justice could be followed out. Would you recommend that?
I absolutely would recommend that as a member of civil society who cannot speak in public without a security detail because of the amount of death threats I receive for my work on ending violence against women in Canada. And I have had rare occasions where folks have been criminalized for their behavior. But to your point, I absolutely agree that if a member of Parliament cannot get justice for someone who is repeatedly harassing them, how do we expect a 25-year-old single mother who's being harassed by an intimate partner but using fake aliases online to get justice? this. So absolutely, there needs to be a stronger mechanism. And that, to me, is part of the broader conversation around social media platforms are an industry. They need to be regulated. The fact that I can't see news on Instagram and Facebook tells me the government has made attempts to regulate those industries, but they haven't made any headway when it comes to exactly the topic that you were talking about today.
And I'm looking at low-hanging fruit that the government could, implement in short order. I know that there's a bill before Parliament that has received a lot of controversial scrutiny. It looks at setting up a very big bureaucracy that's years out. That debate hasn't started in Parliament yet, so I'm going to focus my remarks on things we could do in very short order within the existing criminal code to get justice. So that would be my second thing, and I'll go to Samara in a second. But I want to put the last recommendation that I have. So let's say that came to pass, where there was a tool by which, if a behavior online had reached a certain threshold, that an order could be given to social media platforms to disclose identity, right? And I'm not talking about for freedom, it's harassing behavior. The next thing is what's to be done about it, okay? So in those scenarios, what often happens is that identity might come out, people might know it's happening, but there's this gray area on whether or not the person can continue to contact you. And oftentimes what will happen is one account might be shut down, but then there's another, it's very easy to create a different email address, right? It's difficult to block people that are constantly harassing. So in that scenario, when there's a threshold of behavior reached as determined by the court, would you recommend that, I'll use a term that would have to be defined, but that a judge could issue an online restraining order that would prevent almost in perpetuity a person, if the judge so deemed it, that person from contacting somebody by any means online, so that that behavior stops and it is a tool to de-escalate that behavior into violence. Would you either of you recommend that?
Witnesses, just to let you know, and I'm sorry to rush, about 30 seconds or so on the response. Thank you.
I would say, yeah, we should put conditions on people who are threatening people's lives. That shouldn't be controversial.
Samara?
I would agree, and I would add that there needs to be a public education component to this, because people don't know where they're supposed to go for recourse, whether that's to the platform itself or to the police. Education for judges would also be necessary here in order to have the appropriate level of digital literacy to navigate this terrain. And we also want to see tech platforms have better content moderation practices, so this isn't an issue in the first place, and to also reduce the amount of times that someone can be anonymous online.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Ms. Dama, for 6 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I want to thank both of the witnesses here today for the work that you've done. Ms. Lalonde, I've read your book. I follow your posts, and myself and my staff did your bystander training. And you do amazing work. And you do it in spite of the threats and harassment that you get. So I just would personally like to thank you. The Mayor of Burlington, Ontario, Marianne Mead Ward, brought together all of the women who are elected in Halton Region. And she's been doing this for a few years, and after I announced that I wasn't running again, she drafted up a pledge that was signed by, I think it's 2122 women in Halton Region. I just want to read it, that we, the women of HER, which is Halton elected representatives, 1, pledge to support each other and call out abuse and harassment when we see it or experience it. 2, call on our allies to stand with us to support women in office and call out all forms of abuse and harassment. 3, call on elected officials to uphold the highest standards of conduct, focusing on respectful debate on the issues and not personal attacks. And 4, call on the relevant authorities to ensure the protection of individuals who speak out against abuse and who experience abuse, providing them with the necessary support and resources. Ms. Lalonde, I'm going to start with you because I feel that touches a little bit on the type of bystander training that you do. And so a lot of times as MPs, we don't call out others on what is put out into the into the public sphere. I'm just wondering if you can maybe comment on your thoughts on that pledge and whether you think it would be helpful. And then I'll turn to Samara.
I think certainly it would be helpful. I mean, it's an all hands on deck situation, and to assume that there's some sort of silver bullet that's going to solve everything, it's going to be a multi-pronged approach. But I do think that it bodes really well when you see cross-party support around these issues. So to call out how another member was treated, regardless of whether or not they're part of your team, that shows that civility is important, that we have respect. And to speak to the point that was made earlier, I know that behind the cameras, folks are going out for lunch, they're having chit-chats, and that's important that you're checking in with each other. But being more open and public about those gestures, right, normalizing that behavior, by definition encourages bystanders. But I think it shows that it's not about partisanship, it's about civility, and it's about safety, fundamentally. Like, yes, we know women and folks of color are predominantly being targeted in politics, but when you see the vitriol, nobody wants to join that club. Like, it is not, your job does not look appealing from the outside. I'm here to tell you, like, at all. And that's a problem for democracy, right? And so I think any attempt, even if it comes across initially as lip service, of cross-party calling this stuff out is powerful stuff, and I would like to see more of it. And I'll pass it to Sabrina.
We know from our exit interviews that MPs are collegial. You are friends. You do have lunch. You do have group chats together. And the public would like to see a lot more of that side of the job. These types of pledges, Ms. Damoff, are certainly helpful, but I don't think we need to see a kind of flattening or segmenting of the experience across race or gender lines all the time. That can be useful to help us set a baseline for improvements or to get some necessary context. But I think we want to see, and the public wants to see, all MPs demonstrating collegiality and civility towards each other. And it's not just the burden of those who are experiencing the most violence to stick up for each other and protect each other. There's a role for everyone to play to demonstrate the kind of productive and collegial workspace that we know can exist, that does exist in a lot of the time, and that needs to be more visible to the public.
I forgot to set my timer, Chair. How much time have I got left?
That's enough.
Okay, thank you. To your point, I think we did see a lot of that when Karen Vecchio was removed as chair of the Status of Women Committee, and you saw MPs from all parties and the public, quite frankly, but MPs from all parties speaking out about the good work that she had done, and you don't often see that displayed publicly, so, point well taken. Do you think that as MPs we have a responsibility to set the tone for the public? Some of this discourse is going to happen anyway, but do we have a responsibility to set the tone ourselves and set examples for the public?
Would you like me to answer
Sure.
that? Yeah, okay. Yes, the answer is yes.
And not to rush, Ms. Dillon, but please, as concisely as you can. Thank you.
Yes, we need to see MPs modeling the behavior. Teachers are currently embarrassed to bring their students to question period because they don't want to expose their students to that behavior. Nobody wants that. That's not the kind of environment that we want for our democracy to function in. So yes, there is a role to model that behavior online and offline.
Thank you very much. Madame Gaudreau, parole à vous pour...
Ms. Gaudreau, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question, and we've seen that over the last hour, we've seen a demonstration of courage. I don't know if you've been able to listen, but we saw examples where we spoke about misogynistic verbal violence. And Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask this question to Ms. Lalonde. So I'd like to hear you speak about the increasing misogynist speech that we're hearing today. Well, you mean the freedom to speak about misogyny? Is that what you mean? No, the freeing of it. That is, it's transformed. Decades ago, it was unacceptable, and today, we're in another space That is where this can contribute to somebody's search for power to show that one is misogynist, and we show it. Well, it's, as was mentioned this morning, it's just not because when we speak about experiencing harassment as a woman that we're told that it's not true in some cases, but even in some cases we're just told, well, tough luck. Figure it out. If you can't do this, you don't have the necessary confidence, you don't have the tough skin required, maybe this isn't for you. But when men have mental health crises, people say, oh my goodness, the courage you have, etc., etc. I think it's also part of the problem. It isn't just that we as women are more often targets of harassment, but it's the fact that we've lost the right to speak about it in a free fashion without being told, look, it's not true, you're just too weak to do this job. I think that is where the problem lies. What happens is often women decide, look, I don't want to identify as a woman. I don't want to be identified as an MP who's also a woman. I just want to be identified as an MP. Well, yes, but misogynists will say, well, don't forget that you are a woman. So it's our freedom to speak about it is compromised at this point, and that greatly concerns me because that is part of the freedom of speech, of expression. Often we're speaking about ending harassment. People say, well, what's going to happen to the freedom of expression? Well, what happens to my freedom of expression right now? Because I can't talk about feminism in public without having a security officer next to me. What does this say? Thank you. So a question for Ms. Dillon. I'm very pleased that you're closely following politics. But why is it that this environment is being tolerated? It's even accepted. I'd like to hear you speak about this. On the one hand, we have citizens asking us to change our conduct and asking us to be civilized. Others, on the other hand, say, well, no, just, go for it. Rammer. So what underlies this? What are the causes?
One key cause is technology's influence in our democracy, particularly over the last decade, where we've seen social media platforms develop content recommendation systems that favor divisive and harmful content. Harmful content, particularly what is experienced by elected officials, journalists, others who occupy, we can call them professions of democracy, are getting attacked online, and we end up seeing that material far more than any of the positive stories about civic engagement in our local communities. We've also seen a reduction in local journalism. Local newsrooms have been decimated over the last couple of years, and all of that is changing the proportion. A lot of what we're hearing about and that sense of tension and anxiety that we're experiencing right now is because the harmful material is out of proportion with our norms, and it's distorting our sense of our democratic values.
Merci beaucoup. Madame Lalonde, j'aimerais aussi vous entendre.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lalonde. I'd like to hear you speak about the effects of nonverbal behavior. So at the beginning, I was speaking about a disrespectful attitude, which is often discreet. For example, it's when we look at our phone when somebody's talking to us or not looking at that person or blatantly not listening. So every day, I'm seeing what is taking place, but I'd like to hear you speak about this. So, is this part of harassment? Yes, absolutely. So, body language has an effect on bullying. It's not just a lack of respect, as you said. That is, I'm on my phone when you're speaking to me, or I speak to somebody next to me, I'm not paying attention to you. But it's also rolling your eyes. It's body language to simply cross your arms while you're looking at somebody. It's not we're weak, but we're not silly. We know what bullying is about. We know what it means when somebody says, well, no, I haven't said a thing. Certainly, you are doing something, and you need to speak out about that lack of respect. So it's not okay to say that, look, you're not allowed to move your arms. That's not it at all. I'm a Francophone, and I like to, throw my hands around. But let's be realistic. We are adults. Let's be realistic is that when we're speaking about a lack of respect, we know what this is about. We know what this beast is about, but we often don't have the guts to stand firm and say that is enough. To the point where, look, nothing is changing. We're going in circles. Honestly, I think we simply don't have the courage to end that discussion. Well, I hope that you're going to give us some courage and that this message will be conveyed. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Lalonde. Thank you, Ms. Gaudreau.
For 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both the witnesses as well for joining us on this important study. I think that I struggle. We talk a lot, and I think that they're important. We talk a lot about those tools, rules and tools that we need to implement, and I think that that's very clear. But I'm also frustrated in that it seems fairly reactive. And we're not, maybe I would like to talk about the proactive. And I don't know, I've certainly worried about if that's just a matter of peer pressure. There was conversations earlier with Ms. Demoff about that bystander mentality. Could you both expand on that, though, beyond that? What else? What we have to do as members of Parliament to raise the level? And it's our own behavior, but beyond that as well?
Certainly. I would say bystander intervention training, it needs to be mandatory. It needs to be across the board. I work with a program where I teach bystander intervention to children ages 3 to 10. It's a life skill. It's like administering CPR. It's about, naloxone. Like it's a life skill of if you see someone in distress. And I want to reference something that was said earlier this morning about people are not doing well. If you take public transit, you can tell people are not doing well. If you wait in a drive-through that takes too long, people are popping off at a rate that we've never. People are not well. And so bystander intervention skills are life skills that we need to make standard across the board. But certainly in the House of Commons, both amongst MPs, amongst members, amongst staffers, amongst interns, that's something that is by definition culture change. Because it's not putting the onus on the person who's been targeted to be the only one to raise it. It's I was there, I saw it, I'm going to say something, I'm going to set partisanship aside and say ultimately we all benefit by putting a stop to this. I would also say, although it feels reactive, to return to the point that was made earlier by Ms. Rempel-Garner, we do need to also look at how we even define harassment in terms of the criminal code, and that changing that is an opportunity for public education. Stalking has only been illegal in Canada since 1993. And until I started an organization in January, there was not a single organization in Canada's history focused on stalking. So there's nobody to talk about what this looks like to help us get into the weeds. And this is an opportunity that you have here, and that by changing that legislation, yes, it's responding, but you're raising awareness on this is what, we're not talking about people being annoying on the internet. We're talking about people threatening our lives and impeding our ability to do our jobs. So that public education piece is by definition prevention as well. So the bystander and redefining criminal harassment, in my view.
This is a self-regulating culture. So this is a time where there's pressure to be reactive and move really quickly and just be in the moment and short-sighted. But in a self-regulating environment, you can take a minute, take a pause, and really think deeply about what kind of culture do you want. In this moment of democratic backsliding, Canada has a leadership opportunity here. We can really step up on the world stage and set some new norms. The stakes are pretty high. And from our exit interviews, we hear really mundane and straightforward recommendations of what would make a difference. Start as you mean to go on. Put that culture training and piece into the onboarding process and set a code of conduct and norms at that spot. And then pair new MPs with ones that are more experienced and maintain that nonpartisan opportunity and potential throughout.
I do believe our caucus used to do that, but it was one of the many things that was lost during COVID and after. So it's an important point. I wanted to talk a bit, and I think that Ms. Gaudreau was kind of getting to it a bit, but I wanted to explore it more. We heard from the two witnesses before the two MPs about extreme examples of what harassment is and what it leads to, and that verbal violence that was seen. But there are microaggressions. Can you both talk about what you've seen in terms of those, what examples of those, and how we better deal with them?
Sure, I can speak to that. So, in our exit interviews, we're talking to people who aren't in the job anymore, so they can be very open and reflective about what they experienced. And their comment is often that, "Wow, I had all this to say, and nobody's ever asked me these questions before." And then they're able to unpack all of the ways in which they felt slighted or undermined or attacked in varying ways of severity. And it's often women who are really downplaying the extent of abuse and incivility that they that they encountered. And as a result, there's a lot of compartmentalization that happens. And this affects male colleagues as well because they're bearing witness to this, they're experiencing it with colleagues that they care about. And if we think about this from a sustainability perspective, at the end of the political career, a lot of doors can be closed, and that healing and recovering from the compartmentalization that's necessary to perform this job needs to be addressed. That's a serious mental health and wellness issue. It's a public good issue. How are we taking care of our public servants after they've completed their service to us? So there's a duty of care element to this as well. So what we're talking about is not just what happens on the job. It's hard on the campaign trail. The digital campaign trail in particular can be very abusive and toxic. Very few training and supports available there. The job is hard, and then post-job is also incredibly challenging. And so there's a lot of responsibility that we need to account for across that civic journey.
In terms of so I did want to include that, yes, our job is hard. We've talked about the impacts on staff, the supports around us within the institution.
Matheson, sorry, very quickly on the final question.
I, as a staffer, took your training on harassment. Are there anything else in terms of mandatory trainings that you think should be provided to staff that support us in that way for the institution?
Yeah, very quickly, I would say there are lots of folks doing great bison intervention work. What we also know is that if you don't do booster training 6 to 8 months afterwards, people don't lose the skills, but they lose the confidence because they've spent 6 months being told to just shut up and stay quiet. So it needs to be a continuous conversation so folks don't lose that confidence. And there also needs to be some sort of trauma-informed training done with those who are on the front lines, who are being subjected to the abuse, not just from social media, but on the phones and at the constituency offices, so that those folks don't burn out and that we keep them in the world of politics, which is where they want to be.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lalonde, Ms. Dellin, thank you very much for joining us today. Colleagues, thank you very much for your patience and for a productive meeting. Right before we adjourn, I believe everyone has received a copy of the budgetary numbers that we need to pass for both the cyber hacking study as well as the one that we are currently undertaking. I'm looking around the room to see that there is no objection to that budget. Excellent. Okay, with that, colleagues, the budget is passed. I adjourn this meeting, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you next week back here.
you.